After my son told me I wasn't welcome at Christmas, I climbed into my aging work van and left without a word. 40 missed calls hit my phone over the next 3 days. My name is Clifford Harmon, 71 years old. For 4 years, I quietly covered the $4,200 monthly mortgage on the sprawling suburban property where my son Derek and his wife Nadine make their home. To keep that money flowing, I squeezed myself into a modest one-bedroom apartment, the minimum I needed to hold the arrangement together. Yet there I stood on their frostbitten porch that Christmas Eve, and the truth landed hard to them. I wasn't a father. I was an automated clearinghouse. 4 decades, I worked as a structural engineer, designing and raising municipal bridges from one end of this state to the other. I understand down to the decimal how much pressure a foundation absorbs before the first fracture appears. I can calculate the exact point at which a load-bearing beam surrenders under weight that never lets up. Bridges and human bonds run on the same physics they need, upkeep, they need balance, and the stress has to be shared across the whole span. For 4 solid years, every ounce of that weight had been resting on my shoulders alone, and I could feel the structure groaning beneath it. My wife left this world 5 years ago, and the quiet that moved into our old family home after that was a quiet that pressed down like concrete. Welcome back to His Hidden Revenge. Glad you're here with me today. If this channel has ever made you feel something, tap that subscribe button so the next story finds its way to you. Quick question before we begin. Are you listening on headphones right now or through a speaker? It matters to me because this is the kind of story that deserves to be heard close. A note. Before we go further, some elements of this story have been shaped for the purpose of storytelling, and any resemblance to specific real persons or events is entirely coincidental. What matters is the truth at the heart of it. Those empty hallways rang with memories too heavy for one man to carry. Derek had recently married Nadine, a woman whose appetites ran well ahead of her paycheck. They were crammed into a rental unit buried under wedding debt and vocal about every square foot they lacked. What they wanted was a 5-bedroom craftsman in a gated subdivision with manicured lawns and a neighborhood association. Their credit history said no. Their savings said the same. They had nothing to bring to the table but demands and a sense of entitlement. I made the kind of decision grieving fathers make when they confuse love with payment. I bought their happiness outright. I acquired the property through a limited liability company I controlled, structured that way to protect the asset. I told Derek and Nadine that I had arranged a specialized mortgage in their names and that I would absorb the $4,200 monthly payment out of my retirement funds until they found their footing. A temporary measure, I called it a crutch to lean on until Derek's promotion came through. To keep that money moving without raiding my core investment portfolio, I sold the family home and relocated to a cramped, drafty 1-bedroom above a commercial dry cleaner. My mornings ran to the hiss of industrial washing machines and the rumble of linen supply vans. My kitchen had room for one small table and little else. I wore worn corduroy shirts, heavy canvas trousers, and steel-toed boots that had logged more years than most people care to count. By every outward measure, I was a man barely keeping his head above water. That was by design. I wanted to know whether the son I had raised would value my presence once I appeared to have nothing left to offer but myself. The answer unfolded slowly, and it was agonizing. Derek's calls narrowed down to pure logistics. My phone would light up on some Tuesday afternoon, and my chest would lift for a moment. Maybe he was calling to ask how my week had gone, maybe to suggest coffee. What came instead were clipped, hollowed-out transactions. Dad Owen needs a private geometry tutor this semester. $800. Can you cover it? Dad Nadine wants to redo the landscaping before the neighborhood block party. We need another $1,000. Dad, the property taxes are coming due. You're handling that, right? No warmth. Not a single question about my arthritis, which lit up every winter when the damp worked its way through my apartment walls. Just invoices delivered in a familiar voice. And I paid them. Every last one. I was running a stress test on my own family, watching the load-bearing walls of that relationship bow and splinter beneath the weight of their entitlement. Nadine was a different breed of cold. On the rare occasions I visited, always scheduled, well in advance, always brief, she received me the way a building super receives a code inspector. My scuffed boots on her hardwood floors drew visible contempt. A coaster materialized in her hand before I had even chosen a seat. The structure didn't fail with a blowout or a screaming match. It failed quietly on a frozen evening in late December. 6 o'clock Christmas Eve. The temperature had bottomed out at 14 degrees, and a bitter cutting wind was driving sleet sideways across the subdivision streets. I had given the entire preceding week to that night. I had slow roasted a smoked bone-in turkey breast, basting it for hours until it was perfect. More than that, over the previous 2 months, in the corner of my living room, I'd turned into a workshop. I had hand-built a custom wooden building block fortress for my grandson Owen. Every edge sanded smooth, every piece painted by hand, the whole assembly engineered to stop a small boy cold in his tracks. I wrapped everything, loaded it into my aging work van, and pushed through the worsening storm for 45 minutes across town. The houses in Derek's subdivision were decked out in festive light. Laughter and music leaked through the neighbors' windows. I pulled to the far end of their long driveway, shivering as I gathered the heavy roasting pan and the large wrapped box holding the fortress. I made my way up the salted front walk toward their grand entry. Firelight flickered through the frosted glass panel beside the door. Wine glasses clinked inside, and low-polished conversation drifted underneath the music. I pressed the bell, my breath fogging in the frigid air, my fingers stiff beneath my gloves. I stood there waiting. The music dropped a notch. Footsteps crossed toward the door. The heavy oak door swung open barely, just wide enough for Nadine to fill the gap. She had on a tailored satin blouse and a slim gold necklace resting against her collarbone. A wave of warm cinnamon-scented air rolled across my face. Her eyes swept down my jacket, my snow-crusted boots, the foil-wrapped roasting pan in my hands. Her expression clenched into something between panic and disgust. "Clifford, what are you doing here?" She hissed, voice pitched low so the room behind her wouldn't catch it. I kept my smile level despite the cold gnawing at my face. "I brought the turkey Nadine and I have Owen's gift. Thought I'd drop them tonight so everything is ready for tomorrow." Nadine did not budge. Her hand tightened on the door's edge, knuckles draining white. "Clifford, tonight is my corporate holiday mixer. The senior partners from my firm are right there in the living room. We're hosting a catered formal evening." Before I could fully absorb the fact that I was standing in sleet, with no intention of being invited inside, Derek materialized behind her. He settled a hand on her shoulder and peered through the narrow opening. He had on a tailored blazer and was holding a crystal tumbler of bourbon, the bourbon I had bought him for his birthday. "Dad, what are you doing here?" His tone carried the particular weight of impatient annoyance. "We talked about this. Tonight belongs to Nadine's colleagues." I looked at my son, the boy I had steadied on his first bicycle, whose full college tuition I had written checks for, whose roof stayed above him because of what I gave up every single month. "I just came to drop the food for tomorrow," I said quietly, "and to give Owen his gift." Derek exhaled a sharp clipped sound that the wind carried straight into me. "Dad, you don't really fit what we're going for tonight. My partners can't see you standing on our porch looking like that. Set the food and the box on the mat. We'll bring everything in once the caterers are done." I held his gaze. Sleet was building up across my shoulders. The heat from the roasting pan was working through the foil into my numb hands. "Leave it on the mat, like a delivery driver, like hired help." "And about tomorrow," Derek continued, shifting his weight without giving the door a centimeter more. "We've decided to keep the morning just the three of us. Nadine's been stretched thin by the firm, and we need the quiet. You're not included in the actual Christmas dinner either. Her parents are flying in, and the house is going to be full. We'll phone you sometime next week to catch up." The silence that opened between us was denser than the storm. I studied my son's face, searching for a flicker, a thread of conscience, a shadow of the boy who used to drag me to the armchair and beg for one more story before bed. There was nothing there. Only the flat, efficient gaze of someone who had drawn everything useful from a resource and was now switching it off for the season. "You are not invited. We need our space. Leave it on the mat." In engineering, when a material hits its ultimate tensile strength, the failure isn't gradual. It's instantaneous, and total bonds snap, supports shear, and the whole structure comes down in a heap of wreckage. Standing on that porch, the fiction of my family reached that same threshold and collapsed. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't demand to see my grandson. I didn't drop that roasting pan on their spotless entry stones. Rage is energy released without direction. I am an engineer. I don't release energy. I redirect it. I looked at Derek. I looked at Nadine. I gave them a single slow nod. "I understand," I said. My voice was level, completely stripped of the fatherly warmth they had been drawing against for years. I crouched down. I set the meticulously hand-built building block fortress on the wet welcome mat. I placed the warm roasting pan beside it. I straightened up and took one last look at my son. "Merry Christmas, Derek." I turned away and walked back down the path. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind me, and I heard the deadbolt drive home before I'd taken 10 steps. I got into the freezing cabin of my aging work van. I left the heat off. I sat in the raw cold and let the physical discomfort hold my mind in place. The betrayal sat in my chest like a structural load I hadn't calculated for a crushing pressure demanding release, but I wouldn't release it in tears. I turned the key, pulled away from the glowing subdivision, and threaded through the slick streets with the kind of mechanical focus I'd spent a career building. 3 miles out, the flickering fluorescent wash of a desolate gas station appeared in the dark. I swung into the empty lot and cut the engine near the air pump. The snow had intensified, laying a dense white sheet across the windshield. The quiet was total. I fished my smartphone from my coat pocket. My fingers were rigid from the cold, but my thinking had never been sharper. I opened the banking application. The blue glow of the screen filled the dark cabin. I scrolled past the modest checking account I used for groceries and ordinary expenses. I moved down to the automated transfers section. There it was. The lifeline. The invisible artery through which I had pumped my own resources into their ungrateful hands. Scheduled transfer. 4200. Recipient Derek Harmon, mortgage escrow. Scheduled date December 26th. For 4 years that transfer had run without a hiccup. It was the structural column their whole existence rested on. It paid for the roof sheltering the catered party they were throwing. It paid for the door they had just shut in my face. It was the money that let Nadine dress in satin and gold while I wore worn corduroy and steel-toed boots. I stared into the screen. The cancel button sat at the bottom, outlined in red. I didn't fit their aesthetic. They needed their space. They had written me off as an outdated fixture, something to be left on the welcome mat in the freezing sleet. They were convinced they held all the leverage because they held my grandson and my love hostage. What they had forgotten is a bedrock principle of structural mechanics. The entity providing the support is the one who controls the collapse. I pressed my frozen thumb to the glass. I tapped the red button. A confirmation prompt appeared. "Are you sure you want to permanently cancel this recurring transfer?" "Yes." The screen refreshed. The transfer disappeared. The funds stayed in my account. The cord was cut. I exhaled, my breath fogging the cold air inside the cabin. The pressure in my chest didn't dissolve. It condensed. It sharpened into something useful. I set the phone in the cup holder, shifted the van into gear, and pulled out of the gas station onto the dark highway, heading back toward my cramped apartment. The silence lasted about 30 seconds. The phone rattled hard against the plastic cup holder screen, blazing with a name. Derek. It was 6:45. He had almost certainly just received the automated notification from the bank about the canceled pending transaction. The bank's systems don't hesitate. The phone kept going. It skittered across the console in a frantic, relentless rhythm. I didn't reach for it. I held the wheel's steady eyes on the snow-covered road. I let it ring. I sat with the sound of his panic bouncing around the small cabin. It stopped. A beat later, it started again, ringing, vibrating, insisting. I reached down and picked it up. I accepted the call and brought the phone to my ear. I said nothing. I just listened to the silence on the line. Then Derek's voice cracked through the speaker. He wasn't whispering anymore. He had stepped clear of the corporate mixer. The background behind him was quiet, probably the garage away from the guests. "Dad, are you there? Listen, I just got a weird automated alert from the bank. It's saying the escrow transfer for the 26th was canceled. You need to call their customer service right now and get the tech glitch sorted out. The grace period runs out on the 1st, and we cannot have a late fee on our credit report. Call them and fix it." He did not ask whether I had made it home safely through the ice. He did not apologize for leaving me standing in the sleet on his porch. He issued a directive to the machine he expected to keep dispensing on schedule. I listened to his breathing. I listened to the perfect, arrogant assumption that I was a malfunctioning component awaiting repair. "Dad, are you listening to me? Call the bank." I lowered the phone from my ear. I pressed the red button and ended the call. I set the phone on the passenger seat and switched on the radio, letting the low murmur of a late-night broadcast fill the van. The first domino had dropped. The foundation had been pulled out. And as I drove back to my tight apartment above the dry cleaner, I understood with absolute cold certainty that the full audit of their lives was only beginning. The morning after Christmas was bitter, but I felt nothing as I pushed through the glass doors of Piedmont Federal Bank. The piped-in holiday music overhead was an almost grotesque backdrop to what I'd come to do. I wasn't here to nurse wounds or replay the image of my son bolting the door against me in the freezing dark. I had come to inspect the blueprints of a failing structure. An engineer who finds a hairline fracture in a load-bearing wall doesn't just slap paint over it. He strips the drywall and examines the entire foundation. I went straight to the teller and asked for the branch manager. The manager, a younger man named Alden, recognized me on sight. My appearance gave nothing away. Worn canvas trousers, a plain wool coat, the same man I'd always been. But Alden knew the account balances attached to the limited liability company I held with that branch. He walked me into his glass-walled office without hesitation. I told him I needed every financial record connected to my social security number pulled up in front of me. I needed confirmation that the $400 to $200 automated transfer I'd canceled from my van the night before had been permanently revoked. Alden worked his keyboard for a moment, then nodded. The transfer to Derek's mortgage escrow was gone. The funds were sitting safely in my primary holding account. Under ordinary circumstances, that would have been the end of the meeting. The hemorrhage on my retirement had been stopped, but my engineering instincts were picking up a frequency I couldn't dismiss. The contempt I had been shown on that porch was too absolute, too practiced to be simple entitlement. It was the confidence of a man who believed he held complete untouchable dominion over his income source. I asked Alden to run a full audit on all auxiliary accounts. The corner printer stirred to life. He collected a sheaf of pages and set them on the desk. He glanced at the top sheet, a small crease forming between his brows. He slid the page across the polished surface toward me and asked whether I wanted to review the activity on the joint emergency checking account. I looked at the numbers printed on that page. For a fraction of a second they blurred, and something from a decade ago walked back into the room. 10 years ago, when my wife was diagnosed with aggressive pancreatic cancer, our lives came apart into a continuous blur of hospital stays and hospice arrangements. I had opened this particular high-yield checking account specifically to handle the relentless tide of medical costs, a dedicated reservoir to guarantee her final days were as comfortable as I could make them. Because I was spending entire days and nights terrified that the stress would put me in a hospital bed of my own, I added Derek as a secondary signer on the account. I told him plainly this was a failsafe, the glass to be broken only if I was incapacitated. My wife passed away 5 years ago. I had not touched that account since the morning I settled her final funeral expenses. I had left the remaining balance, roughly $80,000, where it was drawing interest, a quiet monument to the worst year of my life. I looked at the figure Alden had placed in front of me. The balance was not $80,000. It was barely $14,000. A cold mechanical clarity moved through me. I did not gasp. I simply asked Alden to print the itemized withdrawal history for the previous 24 months. The printer cycled again, producing the transaction logs page by page. I lifted the stack and began to read with the same detached precision I once applied to evaluating snapped cables on a failed suspension bridge. The pattern was rhythmic, consistent, predatory. On the third day of every single month, exactly $1,500 had been pulled from the medical emergency fund. I traced the routing numbers. The destination was no hospital. It was no pharmacy. The money had been flowing directly into a secondary checking account held solely by Derek and Nadine. I asked Alden to pull the destination details on those specific transfers. Because the movements were internal, between linked accounts, he had the clearance to trace exactly where the money had landed. He typed quickly, his color draining, as the picture came into focus. The funds set aside for a dying woman's comfort were being systematically harvested to underwrite a luxury lifestyle. $700 a month was being routed to the Cedarbrook Country Club for their exclusive couples membership. $800 a month was being auto-drafted to a high-end vehicle leasing company in the city. Derek and Nadine were rolling through their gated subdivision in 2 leased black luxury sedans, financed entirely by the money I had set aside to keep his mother out of pain. I sat in that quiet office, the low hum of the air conditioning, the only sound in the room. What I was looking at represented a fundamental shift in the nature of the betrayal. The cruelty on the porch the previous night had been emotional. This was something else entirely: systematic, deliberate theft. Derek hadn't simply shut me out of his holiday party. He had been quietly bleeding my life savings while looking me in the eye, turning my grief into his personal expense account. He saw me not as a father, but as a host to drain until nothing remained. Alden cleared his throat nervously and asked whether I wanted to dispute the charges. He reminded me that because Derek was a legal signer on the account, the bank's position was that these were authorized withdrawals. From a strictly administrative standpoint, Derek had the right to move those funds. The bank could not pursue him for spending money he technically had access to, regardless of the moral dimension. I set the papers back on the desk. Disputing charges with a customer service representative was not what I had in mind. I wanted the parasite severed entirely. I instructed Alden to freeze the account immediately, a complete lockdown on every financial product bearing my name, requiring my physical presence and a government-issued ID for any future movement of funds. I watched him enter the security protocols and confirm that Derek's digital access was permanently cut off. As Alden finished locking down the profiles, he clicked over to a separate tab on his monitor. He paused, his hand hovering over the mouse. He looked at me with a sudden heavy pity that made my jaw tighten. He asked whether I was aware of the recent credit activity tied to the emergency medical account. I told him I hadn't opened a line of credit in over a decade. Alden turned the monitor fully around so I could read the screen. 3 months earlier, a substantial line of credit had been attached to the joint checking account, an unsecured loan for $45,000, using the remaining cash balance as the basis for approval. The loan had been drawn down completely within 2 weeks of being opened. The funds had gone directly to a high-end home renovation contractor in the city. Nadine had wanted new landscaping and a full overhaul of her outdoor entertaining space for her corporate events. I studied the digital signature displayed on the application form. The bank required the primary account holder to authorize any credit extension of that size. My name was signed at the bottom of the document. I leaned in closer to the monitor. I am an engineer. My entire professional life has been built on precise drafting, exact blueprints, strict architectural schematics, a signature that is a rigid calculated sequence of sharp angles and consistent proportions. What was on that screen was a sloppy, rushed imitation. The loops ran too wide. The pressure was uneven throughout. It was the mark of a desperate man attempting to replicate a precision instrument with a broken tool. Derek had forged my signature. The entire scope of the situation shifted in an instant, breaking clean through the walls of a family dispute. Pulling funds from a joint account was a civil gray area, morally bankrupt, but something law enforcement would walk away from. Forging a signature on a federally insured credit application to extract $45,000 was an entirely different matter. That was a felony. Wire fraud, identity theft, financial elder abuse. I asked Alden to print the fraudulent credit application complete with the forged digital signature and to have it stamped with the bank's official verification seal. I offered no explanation for what I intended to do with it. I simply gathered the thick stack of documents, folded them carefully, and tucked them into the inner pocket of my wool coat. I thanked Alden for his time, and listened as he offered to connect me with the bank's fraud department. I declined. I told him the fraud department would only slow things down. I walked out through the glass doors and back into the freezing December morning. The sky was flat and gray, offering nothing. I climbed into my aging work van, turned the ignition, and let the engine settle into its rhythm. I did not head back to my cramped apartment. I did not call Derek to demand answers or unload on him about what I'd found. Shouting would only hand him time to rehearse a story, time to move assets, time to fortify his position. Instead, I merged into traffic and pointed toward the downtown business district. I was going to see a man who had no interest in feelings or family mediation. I was going to a man who made his living dismantling financial liabilities with surgical precision. The theft had given me the exact blueprint I needed to bring down the gilded structure my son had erected on my back. The warning signs had gone unaddressed long enough. The structural integrity was gone, and I was ready to initiate the controlled demolition. My phone sat completely silent on the passenger seat. Derek had no idea the emergency account was frozen. He didn't know the credit line had been flagged. He had no inkling that the foundation of his pristine suburban life was already giving way beneath him. I pressed the accelerator down, the engine running, with a quiet, purposeful momentum as I drove toward the lawyer's office. The period of silent observation was finished. The audit was complete. It was time to hand them the bill. I pulled up 2 blocks from a towering glass high-rise that housed the most aggressive corporate litigation firm in the state. I pushed through the revolving doors, my snow-crusted boots marking the polished marble floor. The receptionist looked at my worn wool coat with practiced polite skepticism. She asked if I was looking for someone. I told her I was there to see Beckett. Beckett was not a family attorney. He didn't wade into contentious divorces or contested custody arrangements. He dismantled corporations. He liquidated hostile assets. He was a predator who happened to wear a navy pinstripe suit. And he owed my late wife his entire career. 30 years ago, she had covered his law school tuition when he was a sharp but broke kid from our neighborhood. He never forgot that debt. When he came into the lobby and spotted me standing there, he brushed past the receptionist without a word and pulled me into an embrace. He walked me through a corridor of glass-walled conference rooms and into his private corner office overlooking the frozen city. He poured 2 glasses of bourbon and slid one across the broad mahogany desk. He took one look at my worn clothes and shook his head. He asked how long I planned to keep up the act. He asked when I was going to stop living like a pauper and actually touch the money. I wrapped my hands around the glass, feeling the warmth of it against my cold palms. I took a slow sip. I told him the act was over. I told him the stress test had returned catastrophic results. Beckett leaned back in his leather chair. He knew precisely what I meant. He was the only living person who knew the full truth of my financial situation. When my wife passed away 5 years ago, she hadn't simply left me with a silent, empty house. We had spent decades making calculated, aggressive investments in commercial real estate and emerging technology. We never drew down the principal. We lived on my engineering salary and let the capital compound quietly in the background. By the time she died, those accounts held $200,000 in liquid assets. I never told Derek. I never told Nadine. When they grumbled about wedding debt, I pretended to tap a modest retirement fund to purchase their house through a blind limited liability company. I relocated to a miserable apartment above a drum cleaner and rotated through the same worn corduroy shirts and heavy canvas trousers for 5 years. I needed to know who my son actually was. I needed to know whether he would show up for a father who had nothing left to give but his time. I had to find out whether his love was genuine or entirely contingent on a reliable flow of money. I laid all of this out for Beckett as the snow drove hard against his office window. I told him how they had left me on their freezing porch on Christmas Eve because my appearance didn't suit their aesthetic. I told him how they had cut off my access to my grandson. I told him how I had finally canceled the automated mortgage payment that morning. Beckett listened in complete silence. His predatory instincts were already running the numbers on the fallout. He asked what else I had done. I reached into the inner pocket of my coat and pulled out the thick stack of documents the bank had printed for me. I laid them flat on his desk. I told him I had audited the joint emergency checking account we'd opened 10 years ago to handle my wife's hospice care. I watched Beckett slide on his reading glasses and bend over the pages. The room went very quiet as he traced a finger down the itemized transaction logs. He caught the pattern immediately. He saw the steady predatory drain of $1,500 pulled out every single month. He traced the routing numbers straight to the luxury vehicle leases and the exclusive country club dues. His expression hardened into a mask of professional contempt. He looked up and confirmed what the bank had already told me. Beckett explained that from a civil standpoint, this was a difficult case because I had named Derek as a secondary signer on the account during my wife's illness. He technically held the administrative authority to move those funds. Beckett cautioned that if we brought this before a civil judge, it could easily be framed as a generous father voluntarily supplementing his son's finances. Courts rarely concern themselves with the moral bankruptcy of a son raiding his dying mother's medical fund to pay for country club access. Civil proceedings would stretch on for years, bleed my energy, and produce nothing more than a token judgment. I didn't interrupt him. I let him finish. I knew what was waiting in the next page of that stack. Beckett turned it over. He stopped mid-sentence. The air in the room seemed to go still. He was reading the final document, the unsecured credit line application for $45,000. He noted the destination of the funds, a high-end landscaping and renovation contractor. He noted the date the account was opened 3 months prior. Then his eyes dropped to the digital signature field at the bottom of the page. He studied the erratic loose loops that were supposed to represent my name. He knew my handwriting. He had watched me sign dozens of architectural blueprints and legal trusts over the years. Beckett took his glasses off and set them carefully on the desk. He looked at me, his voice dropping a register. He asked me point blank whether I had authorized that credit extension. He asked me whether that was my signature on the document. I held his gaze without blinking. I told him I had not touched that account in 5 years. I told him my son had fabricated my signature to secure $45,000 and fund a patio for his wife's corporate events. A slow, dangerous smile moved across Beckett's face. The energy in the room changed entirely. This was no longer the story of a grieving father trying to recover pilfered savings. We were now holding a loaded weapon. Beckett leaned forward, hands locked together on the mahogany desk. He walked me through exactly what we had in front of us. He said this had moved well beyond a messy dispute over joint funds. This was a direct violation of federal law. Derek had used a digitally transmitted document across state banking lines to obtain funds under false pretenses. That was aggravated identity theft. That was financial elder abuse. And most critically, that was federal wire fraud. Beckett laid out the architecture of the trap we were about to construct. A civil lawsuit, he explained, would only give them time to retain a defense attorney and shift their assets out of reach. We needed the trap to close on its own, fully and finally. We needed to back them into a corner where their arrogance would drive them to make the mistake that finished them. I asked him what our opening move should be. Beckett told me to do nothing at all. He told me to go back to my small apartment and let the silence do its work. The mortgage payment had already bounced. The automated alerts were already stacking up on Derek's phone. When Derek tried to access the emergency medical account to plug the gap, he would find it locked down completely by the bank's fraud department. The panic would take hold fast. Derek and Nadine were propped up by a lifestyle they had no means to sustain on their own. They leased their vehicles. They carried extravagant club fees. They had been running month to month entirely on my hidden support. Once the money stopped moving, their whole arrangement would buckle within days. Beckett assured me that desperation manufactures stupidity. They would come looking for me. They would make demands. And when they came, they would lean on intimidation to try to force my hand. Beckett rose from his chair and crossed to a secure filing cabinet. He withdrew a fresh stack of legal paper and set it on the desk. He told me it was time to load the heavy artillery, because my limited liability company held full title to the property, and Derek was nothing more than a tenant dressed up as a homeowner. We had absolute authority over that house. Beckett began drafting a formal 30-day notice to vacate the premises. He made clear we would not post it by mail. We would not send it via courier. We would hold it and wait for them to come to us. We would let them rage and threaten and expose exactly who they were, and at the peak of their entitlement, we would hand them the notice in person. I finished the last of my bourbon. The warmth of it settled slowly down my throat. The betrayal was complete, but the grief had burned away entirely. My son had looked at me shivering in the freezing dark and decided I was an embarrassment to be kept off his porch. He had looked at the fund meant for his mother's final days and decided it belonged to his country club account. He had forged my name to build his wife a patio. I told Beckett to draw up every document. I told him I wanted no loopholes, no grace periods, nothing left open for negotiation. Beckett nodded. He promised me that when we were done, Derek and Nadine would be stripped of every comfort they had taken without earning. They would lose the house, they would lose the cars, and if they pushed hard enough, they would lose their freedom. I shook his hand, buttoned my worn wool coat, and walked out of the corner office. I rode the elevator down and stepped back into the blizzard. Snow was accumulating on every surface, the city disappearing under a thickening layer of white. I climbed into my aging work van and drove back to my cramped apartment above the dry cleaner. My phone sat silent on the passenger seat the entire way. Derek had stopped calling. I knew he was somewhere staring at his banking application, watching the accounts refuse to open. The panic was already spreading through him. I parked, climbed the narrow stairs to my apartment, and sat down in the dark. No television, no lights, just the silence and me waiting for the desperate strike to come. The trap was loaded. The bait was in position. The legal blade was sharpened and ready. The drive back from Beckett's law firm was a blur of gray slush and slow-moving traffic. When I finally parked behind the brick building, the familiar hum of the industrial washing machines below my apartment rose up to meet me. I climbed the narrow wooden stairs. My knees ached from the cold, but my mind was moving with frictionless precision. I let myself in and stood for a moment in the cramped living space. For 5 years I had occupied this small box, performing the role of a man who had nothing left, all to take an honest measure of my only son's character. The experiment had run its course. The results were definitive. I peeled off my damp wool coat and spread the bank documents flat across the small kitchen table. I am an engineer by profession and by disposition. When a structure gives way, you do not panic. You locate the points of failure. You calculate the total load bearing down on the system. Then you initiate a controlled demolition. I went to the kitchen drawer and pulled out a legal pad and a drafting pen. I sat down and began charting the architecture of my son's complete undoing. The first phase required comprehensive surveillance. Derek had always carried a volatile temper. I remembered a summer evening 20 years ago when he was cut from his high school baseball team. He came home and drove a baseball bat through the glass pane of the garage door. Whenever something he felt entitled to was taken away, his emotional regulation collapsed. Now, I was about to take away his entire world. The moment the bank locked his access to those stolen funds, I knew his panic would convert itself into something physical. I needed every second of what followed on the record. I left the apartment and drove out to an electronics supply store on the far side of town. 4 high-definition wireless surveillance cameras with cloud storage, that's what I walked out with. I drove back and spent the next 2 hours putting them in place. The first went directly above my front door, the lens angled to sweep the entire narrow hallway. If Derek showed up to lean on me, every frame of his face and every word of his threats would feed straight to a remote server. The second camera I tucked inside the living room, hidden behind a row of hardcover books on a high shelf. It gave a clean, unobstructed line of sight across the kitchen table and the entryway. Then I called Beckett from the prepaid mobile. I needed his office wired for audio and video before the day was out. He agreed without hesitation. He knew what it meant to catch a desperate man constructing lies on camera. I drove back downtown and spent an hour inside Beckett's law firm. We seated a discreet lens in the lobby to log the arrival of any unwelcome visitors. Another camera went into his mahogany corner office, positioned precisely to record whoever settled into the client chairs across from his desk. All 4 feeds were linked to a secure application on my phone. I stood in Beckett's office running the audio test. The clarity was unsettling. Every footstep, every crinkle of paper, every spoken threat would be captured with crystalline precision. We were ready for whatever came next. I returned to the apartment as the winter sun dropped toward the rooftops. The streetlights blinked on outside my window, throwing long shadows across the floor. The time had come to execute the legal dismantling of Derek's spotless suburban life. I opened the heavy metal lockbox and pulled out the original incorporation documents for the limited liability company I had formed 4 years prior. When I bought the 5-bedroom Craftsman for Derek and Nadine, I deliberately ran the purchase through a corporate entity registered in Nevada. The purpose was to keep my wealth off the public record, but it also handed me absolute unyielding control over the asset. Derek and Nadine had always believed I simply co-signed a conventional mortgage. They were convinced their names sat on the deed beside mine. They were completely wrong. I smoothed the heavy parchment across the table. Those documents established that my corporate entity was the sole legal owner of the property. Derek and Nadine were legally classified as month-to-month tenants. The $400, $200 payment they expected me to deliver every month was never a mortgage installment. It was a rent transfer. And because I had just canceled that transfer, they were officially in default. I uncapped my drafting pen and started to write. I drafted a formal corporate resolution, dissolving the current tenancy agreement on the grounds of non-payment. I cited the exact statutes permitting an immediate termination of their occupancy. My handwriting moved across the page with sharp, deliberate precision. I set my rigid signatures on the corporate filings next to the sloppy, hurried forgery Derek had submitted to the bank for his $45,000 credit line. The contrast was the difference between a master builder and a careless thief. I then prepared the formal 30-day notice to vacate the premises. I did not soften a single word. No grace period, no invitation to negotiate the arrears. The notice stated plainly that the occupants had defaulted on their financial obligations and were required to surrender all keys and vacate the property before the end of the upcoming month. Failure to comply would bring immediate physical eviction by the county sheriff's department. I slid the signed eviction notice into a thick manila envelope. I added a certified copy of the original deed, confirming they held zero equity in the home. Then I included a printed summary of the joint medical account, showing the steady parasitic withdrawal of $1,500 a month. I wanted them to see the precise mechanism of their undoing. I wanted them to understand that I had tracked every single dollar they had siphoned from my dead wife's hospice fund to underwrite their Cedar Brook Country Club dues. I sealed the envelope and set it at the center of the kitchen table. It sat there like an unexploded bomb. The transformation was complete. The grieving father who had stood shivering on a snowy porch 24 hours earlier was gone, finished the moment his son told him to leave the Christmas gifts on the wet welcome mat like a hired servant. In his place sat a structural engineer who had just pulled the foundational pillars out from under a corrupt building. I crossed to the small kitchenette and poured myself a glass of tap water. Standing at the window, I looked down at the frozen street below. Snow was descending in heavy, silent drifts. I drew my phone from my pocket and opened the security application. The screen divided into 4 distinct grids. The empty hallway outside my apartment door, the quiet interior of my own living room, the dark, elegant lobby of Beckett's law firm, the vacant leather chairs in his corner office. The stage was perfectly set. Every angle covered, every legal document signed and sealed. The offshore accounts were fortified and buried behind layers of encrypted security. Derek and Nadine had spent years treating me like a mindless utility, an automated clearinghouse that required no upkeep and deserved no acknowledgement. They had read my silence as a symptom of weakness and senility. They had grossly underestimated the terrifying patience of a man who builds things to last. I understood the shape of their panic. The holiday weekend was ending. Come morning, the automated banking systems would resume standard processing. The cancellation of the substantial rent transfer would fire off a cascade of alerts. When Derek tried to log into his portal to confirm the funds, he would find the digital gates locked shut. When he reached for the medical emergency account to cover the shortfall, he would trigger the fraud flags I had established with the bank manager. Their pristine, arrogant ecosystem was about to suffer a total systemic failure. The leases on the 2 leased black luxury sedans, gone. The neighborhood association fees, uncoverable. The carefully constructed facade of their success would crack apart in full view of every prestigious colleague they'd spent years impressing. I set the phone down beside the manila envelope on the table. I pulled out the wooden chair, sat and waited in the silence. There was no anger in me. What I felt was an absolute chilling equilibrium. The load-bearing walls of their deception were buckling. The collapse was no longer a possibility. It was an inevitable mathematical certainty. I watched the digital clock on my phone advance minute by minute, knowing the 40 missed calls were only a few hours out. I folded my hands on the table and let the silence settle over me. The architect was ready. The demolition had begun. January 1st arrived on the back of a brutal, unforgiving frost that sealed the windows of my apartment behind a thick shell of ice. The city below was perfectly still. The dry cleaning operation on the ground floor was shuttered for the holiday, and the usual hiss of industrial washing machines and the rumble of linen supply vans were absent from the empty streets. I was awake at exactly 6:00 in the morning, as I always am. No alarm required. My internal clock had been calibrated by 40 years of reaching construction sites before the sun. I moved into the cramped kitchen and filled the coffee pot with water. The linoleum floor was cold against my bare feet. I pressed the power button and watched the black liquid drip slowly into the glass carafe. Then, I sat at my small wooden table and looked at my smartphone lying on the surface. The digital clock read 6:30. Midnight had passed 6.5 hours ago. In the sterile air-conditioned server rooms of Piedmont Federal Bank, a sequence of automated scripts had run through their daily protocols. Algorithms had swept the vast network of accounts scanning for scheduled directives. For 4 years, those algorithms had located my primary holding account, pulled $4,200 from it, and routed it straight into the escrow account tied to my son's suburban property. But last night, the algorithms found nothing. The standing order had been permanently erased. The digital pathway had been severed. I understood exactly how the banking system works. When a high-value automated transfer fails to execute on the first of the month, the system does not pause. It generates an immediate deficiency notice. It assembles an automated email and fires it to the primary contact on file. Derek would have received that email in the early morning hours while he was still sleeping off the excesses of his New Year's Eve party. I poured my coffee and wrapped both hands around the warm ceramic mug. I didn't have to wait long. At exactly 9:15 in the morning, the phone on the table began to vibrate. The sound was harsh and abrasive in the quiet apartment. The screen lit up the dim kitchen, flashing the name Derek in bright white letters. I made no move toward the phone. I sat perfectly still and drew a slow sip of black coffee. I watched the device rattle against the wood until the call rolled to voicemail on its own. A small notification icon blinked onto the screen. A moment later, the phone started up again, and then once more. I just watched. I was running a structural stress test on my son's psychological endurance, documenting the precise rate at which his sense of entitlement would erode into outright terror. After the fifth consecutive unanswered call, I tapped the screen and pulled up the voicemail application. I hit play on the first message and let his voice fill the kitchen. Dad picked up the phone. Derek's voice was thick with sleep and blunt irritation. I just woke up and saw some stupid email from the bank. It says the escrow transfer bounced or got canceled or something. Nadine is extremely annoyed because she has a spa appointment this morning, and this is stressing her out. Call the bank and clear up whatever technical glitch you caused. Let me know when it's done. The message ended with a sharp click. No greeting. No wish for a happy new year. Just a direct command from a man who believed the world existed purely to accommodate his convenience. He genuinely took it for a technical error. His arrogance wouldn't allow him to entertain the possibility that the machine he depended on had deliberately chosen to stop. The morning crept into afternoon. The gray sky outside my window gave nothing in the way of sunlight. The temperature kept falling, and the snow returned in heavy blinding sheets. My phone stayed on the table. It rang every 15 minutes with mechanical regularity. I logged every timestamp on my legal pad. Call 12 at 10:45. Call 15 at 11:30. Call 22 at 1:15. I worked through the next round of voicemails. The irritation in Derek's voice had curdled into genuine anger. His volume had climbed considerably. He was no longer speaking from bed. I could hear his footsteps echoing off the hardwood floors of the house I had purchased. Clifford, this is not a joke. He had dropped the word Dad entirely. The bank customer service line is closed for the holiday, and I cannot get anyone on the phone to override this. You need to answer me right now. I tried to access the emergency medical account to pull the mortgage funds manually, and the entire portal is locked. It says my access has been permanently revoked due to suspicious activity. What did you do? Restore my access immediately before I come down there and make you do it. I wrote the words suspicious activity in my notebook. The fraud protocols I had put in place with the branch manager were performing exactly as designed. Derek had attempted to raid the hospice funds to rescue himself, and had driven straight into a digital reinforced steel wall. The lifeline was severed. The emergency reserves were sealed shut. He was stranded on an island entirely of his own construction, and the water was climbing fast. By 3 hours in the afternoon, the missed call count had reached 30. I sat in my small living room, the legal document stacked neatly in front of me, bearing witness to the total collapse of my son's reality. The 28th voicemail was chaotic. Nadine was shouting in the background. Her voice was high and threaded with panic. I could make out her demanding to know why her credit card had been declined at a luxury boutique downtown. The shockwaves were moving through their entire financial ecosystem. Dad answered the phone. Derek's voice was unsteady now. The aggressive bravado had drained out of it. He sounded breathless like a man running low on oxygen. Nadine just got humiliated at the store. The bank locked our joint checking account. They locked the credit line. They locked everything? I don't understand what is happening. Please call me back. We need that money today or the auto lease is going to default tomorrow morning. Please. I let the recording end. I felt my pulse slow to a steady rhythm. No satisfaction, only the cold composures of a mathematical equation resolving itself. For years, they had treated my resources like an endless self-replenishing well. They had financed leased vehicles and exclusive club memberships using money set aside to ease a dying woman's pain. They had shut me out in freezing sleet because my worn jacket offended their corporate guests. They had taken my silence for a sign of weakness. They were now discovering that my silence was something else, entirely the stillness of a predator, waiting patiently in the dark. The afternoon dissolved into a bleak frozen evening. Shadows spread across the walls of the apartment. I left the overhead lights off. I sat in the darkness, lit only by the faint blue glow of the phone screen. At 6:45, the phone vibrated for the 40th time. I let it ring out. I watched the voicemail icon appear. I tapped the screen and pressed play. The voice that came through the speaker was completely unrecognizable. Not the voice of the arrogant man who had ordered me off his porch. Not the voice of the entitled son demanding I sort out a technical glitch. This was the sound of a broken, terrified animal. Dad, please. Derek's voice was thick with tears. He was crying, gasping between words. Please pick up. I am begging you. A courier just taped a pre-foreclosure warning to our front door. The bank system automatically flagged the house because the primary escrow has a zero balance, and the linked line of credit is currently under federal review for fraud. They said the fraud division is opening an investigation. Nadine is packing a bag. She says she is leaving. Please, Dad, I have nothing. I cannot access a single dollar. They are going to take the house. Please tell me this is just a mistake. I am sorry about Christmas. I am so sorry. Please call me back. The message cut off abruptly, swallowed by the mechanical silence of the application. I set the phone face down on the table. The stress test was officially concluded. The structure had failed completely. His entire life had been raised on stolen capital and forged signatures. The moment the bank identified the forgery on the $45,000 credit line, they had frozen his entire financial network in place. The automated warning taped to his door was only the first tremor of the earthquake still coming. He was broke. He was terrified. He was entirely alone. I reached over and lifted the thick manila envelope from the table. Inside was the formal 30-day eviction notice legally dissolving his tenancy and directing him to vacate the property without delay. I ran my finger along the sealed edge of the paper. I understood that the 40 missed calls were only the opening phase. Desperation would push him out of that house. Desperation would drive him through the freezing snow to my door. He wouldn't wait on a return call any longer. He would come here in person to demand his salvation face to face. I rose from the wooden chair and moved to the front door. I checked the lock. I checked the angle of the hidden security camera mounted above the frame. Everything was in perfect working order. The trap had been baited, and the prey was now hurtling blindly toward the steel jaws. I went back to the kitchen, poured the remaining cold coffee down the drain, and stood in the silent darkness waiting for the knock. It was the evening of January 3rd. The winter storm that had buried the city on New Year's Eve had hardened into a solid sheet of gray ice. I was seated at my small kitchen table with a glass of tap water. The digital clock on the microwave ticked over to 7:14. That was exactly when the heavy, frantic pounding started at my front door. It was not a polite knock. It was the desperate hammering of a man who understood that everything holding his life together was coming apart. The thin wood of my apartment door shook in its frame. I didn't move to answer it. I picked up the phone and opened the security application. The hallway camera showed Derek and Nadine standing beneath the flickering fluorescent light. They looked completely undone. Derek's expensive wool overcoat was spotted with melting snow. Nadine was pacing tight circles, clutching her designer handbag against her chest like a shield. The hammering paused for a fraction of a second. Derek's voice came right through the cheap drywall. He demanded I open the door. He shouted that he knew I was inside because my van was parked in the alley. I drew a slow breath. I confirmed the hidden camera behind the bookshelf in my living room was actively recording. I got to my feet, walked across the cold linoleum floor, and turned the deadbolt. Derek pushed the door open before I had even pulled the handle back. He stepped into my cramped apartment, carrying all the misplaced authority of a corporate executive barking orders at a subordinate. Nadine stepped in right behind him. The two of them carried the raw winter freeze through my doorway with them. Their expensive boots shed slush onto my cheap floor in dark spreading puddles. Derek said nothing by way of a greeting. He showed no interest in how I was. A shaking finger came up and jabbed toward my sternum. Where had I been when he was calling? The bank he was shouting now had thrown a hard freeze across every account he owned. The fraud unit had killed his digital access and killed his debit cards. The dealership handling their vehicles had already rung him twice that morning with repossession warnings because the automated draft had vanished. I gave him nothing back. I let the outrage pour out of him and burn itself down. His face darkened, cycling through panic and fury, while I simply held my ground. No seat offered, no hand extended for their coats. Nadine shouldered past him. Every trace of the polished suburban composure she'd built over years had burned off gone. What was left was pure contracted rage. Her gaze moved around my drafty one-bedroom, like she was touring a condemned structure. She informed me I was a selfish and miserable old man. She was screaming I was deliberately dismantling their lives because of a petty Christmas party dispute. Her credit card, she told me, had been declined publicly at an exclusive boutique with senior partners watching. Nothing in her professional life, she said, had ever shamed her that completely. She closed the distance between us. I had no business cutting off their money like a spoiled child throwing a fit. The funds were owed to them. Hadn't I promised to help them get on their feet? She gestured at my worn corduroy shirt and told me it was obvious I didn't need the money, given that I chose to rot away in a building like this one. Every word landed and I let it. My voice stayed level. I offered no defense of the way I lived. What I absorbed instead was the final unambiguous evidence of what they were. Here they stood inside my home, making a claim on 4 decades of hard physical labor, and sneering at me for the cost of providing it. Derek lunged for Nadine's arm to reel her back, but the fear eating through him made the gesture useless. Those eyes he turned on me were ragged with desperation. Answer the phone right now. Ring the branch manager. Authorize a manual wire, something to plug the mortgage default and the overdue lease payments. And if I cleaned up this mess today, he told me they would overlook my appalling conduct and let me visit my grandson next month. That was the bottom of it. He was dangling Owen in front of me like bait on a hook, trading on my love for the boy to squeeze out a rent payment. I held Derek's gaze. Right there I could see the load-bearing beam of his arrogance develop its first real crack. I turned away from both of them and moved to the kitchen table at my own pace. Nadine's voice went shrill at my back. I was ignoring them, she screamed. She wanted the phone in my hand this instant. The phone stayed where it was. What I lifted from the center of the table was the thick manila envelope. I brought it back to where Derek stood, arm extended the packet offered to him. He yanked it away from me with an exasperated grunt, muttering that a simple bank check would have spared everyone this theater. He ripped it open and dragged out the dense sheaf of documents inside. I observed his eyes move across the top sheet. I could see the effort his mind was making to parse the legal language, the work product of the sharpest corporate litigator in the city. Then, I watched the instant it hit him, the bold heading black on white. 30-day notice to vacate premises. The breath left his body. Every shade of color went out of his face until his complexion matched the gray slush outside. He held the paper away from himself like it might strike. Nadine wrenched it from his grip. What was it? Was it some kind of bank instrument? Derek's jaw moved but produced nothing. His hands had begun trembling so hard the parchment shook audibly in the still apartment. I chose to fill the silence myself. My voice had the measured flatness of an engineer reading out a load-bearing failure report. 4 years ago, I told them I had not co-signed any mortgage. Their wrecked credit histories and the debt they had dragged out of their wedding had made them unbankable at any institution worth the name. I had bought the 5-bedroom Craftsman with cash. No loan, no co-signer. The acquisition ran through a blind LLC I'd incorporated in Nevada. Title sat entirely with my corporate entity. That was the sole legal owner of the roof above their heads. Nadine's eyes were sprinting across the certified deed and the statutory citations. Her head moved back and forth. No, no, no. A lie? They owned that house. 4 years of mortgage payments proved it. I let her finish and then corrected the record. They had not put a single dollar toward the property. Every cent of that $4,200 monthly had come out of my retirement holdings. Their legal status was tenants month to month. When I canceled the transfer, the rent went into default. I watched it register behind Nadine's eyes. She possessed nothing. That grand suburban showcase, those manicured grounds, and the neighborhood association, letterhead, all of it a rental sheet dressed up as ownership. Derek's voice eventually surfaced. It was barely there, a thin shaking thread. How could I do this to family? How could I put them out on the street over a misunderstanding? I tapped the second document in the stack she held. That was the itemized audit of the emergency medical account I had opened 10 years ago to cover my late wife's hospice expenses. No misunderstanding, I told him. Over the past 2 years, I had logged every withdrawal he'd made, every last one. The figures were in my memory without effort. $1,500 a month redirected to fund country club dues. The auto lease arrangements. The full machinery of his comfortable life bankrolled with money I had set aside so a dying woman could leave this world without additional suffering. Derek backed up until the drywall stopped him. His expression was the unguarded look of a man who understands he is completely exposed, no angle left, no cover remaining. My volume never changed. The final strike came out quiet like a bolt driven home on the last thread. 30 days. That was what remained for them to remove their possessions and surrender the property. On day 31, the sheriff's department would do the removing for them, and whatever was left inside would line the curb. The locks would be replaced and a for sale sign would follow. Nadine's mouth came open. She surged a step toward me, face twisted into something beyond fury. One arm came up, fingers curled, nails sharpened into points. 4 years of constructed illusion were on the line, and she intended to defend them. I didn't move a muscle. I raised one finger and directed her attention to the camera lens, seated behind the books on the highest shelf. That device, I told her, was capturing full high-definition audio and video at this moment. The stream was feeding live to a hardened remote server under the supervision of my legal team. She might want to be deliberate about whatever she was planning to do next. She stopped as if the floor had gone solid beneath her. The arm hung there motionless. What crossed her face then was the cold, sickening comprehension of a person who realizes the enclosure they just entered has no exit. Two arrogant predators had strolled into a steel cage and heard the latch close at their backs. The siege in the kitchen was finished. The eviction was now in motion. The quiet in the apartment was complete. Nadine hadn't moved, arms still up, suspended in the cold air gaze nailed to the small, dark eye of the camera lens tucked between my engineering textbooks. Every word she'd screamed, every threatening gesture was already on a server she couldn't reach. The arm came down slowly. She retreated one step, her pristine boots losing their grip briefly on the wet linoleum where she'd tracked in the melting snow. The look she turned on Derek was hollow, the face of someone whose game has collapsed entirely. That scaffolding of superiority they had erected over years had just buckled at every joint. Derek, for his part, was not arriving at the same cold stillness his wife had found. Panic does not behave like a stable material. Drive enough pressure through a weak structure, and it doesn't flex, it fractures. Before we get to what happened next, and what my own son finally revealed about himself when he had nowhere left to hide, I want to ask you something. If someone you had sacrificed decades for turned out to have been quietly working against you the entire time, would you confront them the moment you knew? Or would you stay silent and let the evidence build? It fractures. Derek had spent his entire adult life sealed off from the consequences of his own choices. Anytime a financial shortfall or personal failure materialized, he simply located someone else to absorb the damage. Now, he was boxed into a drafty apartment with his stolen funds out of reach and an eviction notice carrying his name. The understanding that I had engineered his downfall finally punched through his arrogance, and what erupted from the other side was volatile. He turned away from the manila envelope on the table and fixed his eyes on me. The polished surface of the prosperous suburban professional dropped away completely. His shoulders rolled forward and his jaw locked. I thought back decades to a high school counselor who had tried to fail him on a critical examination. Derek had used his physical size to herd the much smaller man into a corner, leveraging pure intimidation until he extracted a passing grade. He was a bully. His entire playbook was built on the assumption that volume and proximity could bend reality. He started crossing the kitchen toward me. I held my position. No shifting of weight, no attempt to open space between us. I stood with the settled certainty of a man who knows precisely what load a steel beam is rated to carry. Derek closed the gap until he was inches from my chest. He was taller and heavier, and the shadow he threw across my face was deliberate. He leaned in his breath, carrying stale mints and sour coffee. His voice dropped into a low, shaking snarl. "Turn the camera off. Walk to the bookshelf. Unplug it. Hand over the memory card. If I did not destroy that footage on the spot," he told me, "the remainder of my life would become something I would not want to live." I looked up at the face of the boy I had raised and told him the camera routed directly to a cloud server. Destroying the hardware would accomplish nothing. The data was already secured inside a digital vault managed by a corporate litigation firm downtown. His expression collapsed into raw, unfiltered fury. Both hands came up and seized the thick fabric of my worn corduroy coat. He balled the material in his fists and wrenched me a step toward him. I was nothing, he told me, a pathetic, lonely old man. He screamed that the house was owed to him, and the money was owed to him. He had tolerated my dull visits and endured my cheap gifts for years, he said, solely to protect his inheritance. Then came the real threats. He would haul me into a courtroom and petition a judge to have me declared legally incompetent. He would locate a physician willing to testify that I was deep into dementia. He would have me committed to a state-run facility, and every asset tied to my name would be liquidated. He was speaking his entire criminal architecture directly into my microphone. Every threat, every acknowledgement of financial predation, every element of his scheme to strip me of my autonomy, all of it flowing into a secure audio record with perfect acoustic clarity. He was personally hammering the nails for his own coffin. Nadine stepped in and seized his shoulder. She tugged at his jacket, her voice climbing into a shrill, desperate pitch. "Stop talking. Let go of the coat." She thrust a finger at the blinking red light on the camera, fully grasping the legal catastrophe they were standing inside. She understood that threatening to have an elderly man falsely imprisoned in a psychiatric ward while physically assaulting him constituted a serious felony one with no viable defense. Derek wasn't listening. He knocked her hand aside and cinched his grip tighter on my collar. He shook me again and demanded I take out my phone and call the bank to release the emergency medical fund. He told me I was going to wire $45,000 to his account immediately, or he would put me through the front window. I did not fight his grip. My right hand moved slowly into the deep front pocket of my canvas trousers. My fingers found the smooth glass face of my smartphone. I had seen this sequence coming. When Beckett and I had wired the surveillance network earlier that day, we built in an emergency protocol. I had programmed a silent panic trigger on the side of the device. One long press of the volume key would fire a distress signal to Beckett's personal line, carrying a live audio feed of my location. I pressed it and held it down. A brief silent vibration told me the signal had gone out. I looked at Derek. I told him he was committing a mathematical error. Applying blunt force to a reinforced structure, I explained, only destroys the object doing the applying. He drew his right fist back, pulling his arm up as a raw primal sound built at the back of his throat. "Shut up and hand over the money." Before that fist could travel forward, the heavy door of my apartment blew open with a violent crash, slamming into the drywall and splitting the silence of the hallway wide open. Two uniformed police officers stepped through the entryway. Their hands rested easy on their utility belts. Their faces offered nothing soft. A wave of frozen air followed them inside. Behind them stood Beckett. He wore a sharp navy pinstripe suit entirely composed despite the blizzard outside. A leather folio was tucked under one arm, and the look he cast across the room was the cool, satisfied gaze of a man watching a hunt conclude exactly as planned. The lead officer pointed a gloved finger squarely at Derek and ordered him to release me and step back with his hands in view. Derek went rigid. The primal fury drained out of him in an instant, replaced by the pale, shaking cowardice of a bully who has just run into something bigger than himself. His fists opened. He stumbled backward, arms going up, eyes ricocheting between the officers and the attorney standing in my doorway. He tried to find his voice. He tried to reassemble the smooth corporate register he used at the country club. It came out as a stammer, a misunderstanding, he said, a private family matter. His father was experiencing a serious cognitive decline, and he had come to calm me down during a severe episode of confusion. Beckett came through the door. He did not look at Derek. He addressed the officers directly. The entire apartment, he told them, was running high-definition audio and video surveillance. He had been watching the live feed from his office down the street. He had clearly heard the suspect threaten to put a 71-year-old man through a glass window in order to coerce an unauthorized wire transfer. Nadine began to cry, not performance, real suffocating tears that streaked down through her expensive makeup. She folded against the kitchen counter, face in her hands. She knew her career, her social standing, and her liberty had all just caved in at once. The second officer drew a notepad from his breast pocket. Before they had even entered the hallway, he informed Derek the active emergency line had already carried the physical threats to their ears. They were formally documenting forced entry trespassing and verbal assault of a senior citizen. He asked Derek to produce identification. Derek's hand went into his pocket, trembling badly. He produced his leather wallet, surrendered his driver's license, then turned his eyes to me, searching, pleading. "Tell them it was a joke," he said. "Just a disagreement about a football game." Then he used the word dad for the first time that evening, and there was no anger in it at all. He sounded exactly like a frightened child. I straightened the collar of my coat. I smoothed out the fabric where his fists had twisted it. I looked at the man in front of me and registered nothing. The foundation had been pulled. The bridge was gone. Only open space remained. I turned to the officers. I told them the man and the woman in my kitchen were unwanted trespassers. I explained that I had recently moved to evict them from a property held by my corporate entity on grounds of serious financial delinquency. I confirmed they had come to my home to coerce me through physical intimidation into releasing funds they had previously stolen. I requested a formal incident report be generated immediately to serve as the foundation for future litigation. Beckett allowed himself a thin, razor-edge smile. He advised the officers that his firm would have a permanent restraining order secured by the following morning, anchored to the documented assault on record. The lead officer gave a single nod. He turned to Derek and Nadine and directed them to move out into the hallway. Any further attempt to contact me or return to the building, he told them, would result in immediate arrest for aggravated assault and trespassing. Derek tried to resist. He attempted to root himself to the linoleum floor. His eyes went to the manila envelope still sitting on the kitchen table, the death warrant for everything he had constructed. The officer stepped in and laid a firm hand on Derek's shoulder, physically steering him toward the door. Nadine offered no resistance. She moved out of the apartment with her head down, eyes fixed blindly on the wet floorboards. She had the look of someone walking toward their own burial. I stood at the center of my small kitchen and watched the officers march my son and his wife down the narrow, dim hallway. The sound of their footsteps receding off the walls faded slowly into the winter night. Beckett pushed the apartment door shut, cutting off the cold draft. He crossed to the table and tapped the thick manila envelope with one finger. He looked at me and gave a single nod. The documentation was immaculate. The physical threat had been captured, verified, and entered into the official record by law enforcement. Derek had delivered precisely the legal leverage needed to dismantle any defense he might attempt to raise. The trap had not merely closed, it had locked. I went to the sink and poured a glass of cold water. I drank it slowly, feeling the chill move down through my chest. The mask had come fully off. The true character of my family had been put on display under the unforgiving light of real consequences. The physical confrontation was finished, but the structural collapse of their world was only beginning to build momentum. I returned to the wooden chair and took up my drafting pen. There was still a great deal of work ahead. The federal wire fraud charges were next on the load list. I opened my legal pad to a clean page entirely undisturbed by the quiet of the empty apartment. The natural order was reasserting itself. 2 days went by after the police escorted my son out of my home. The silence was deep and unbroken. I used the time to organize the digital archive of my full financial history. A desperate man does not simply absorb his defeat and vanish into the winter cold. I knew this. When a trapped animal finds itself in a snare, it does not pause to consider the ethics of its position. It chews through bone to get free. I was waiting for Derek to reach that bone. On the morning of January 5th, my phone went off on the kitchen counter. It was Beckett. He skipped the formalities entirely. Come to the office now. The other side had made their desperate move, and it was a direct strike at my personal autonomy. I drove through the gray slush of the downtown streets and took my seat across from Beckett's mahogany desk. He set a thick binder on the surface between us and fixed me with the cold, focused intensity of a professional who has seen this before. Derek and Nadine had retained a predatory family law attorney. An emergency petition had just been filed in the county court. They were seeking immediate temporary guardianship over my person and my estate. Beckett walked me through the contents. Derek was claiming that my recent financial decisions were the product of aggressive early-onset dementia. He alleged that I was gripped by severe paranoia and delusions. He argued that my choice to evict my own family and freeze the medical accounts demonstrated I was no longer capable of rational judgment. He was petitioning a judge to hand him total control over my physical well-being and full authority over my corporate entities to protect me from myself, as he framed it. I heard the allegations with a kind of detached fascination. It was a complete structural inversion. They were trying to use the very consequences of their own theft as evidence of my mental deterioration. Because I had stopped them from stealing, they were now arguing I was unfit to think. The petition even weaponized Christmas Eve. Nadine had filed a sworn statement claiming I had appeared on their porch in the freezing rain, disoriented and lost. She claimed I had no idea where I was, and that when they tried to assist me, I became violently aggressive. They had taken my patient endurance of their cruelty and recast it as a psychiatric episode. I asked Beckett how any judge could seriously entertain allegations this hollow without medical evidence. He slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. It was an affidavit of cognitive decline, signed by a physician named Dr. Quill. I studied the signature. I had never encountered a Dr. Quill in my life. My late wife's final weeks had been attended by hospice nurses and oncologists I trusted. I myself had not seen a physician for anything beyond a routine physical in 10 years. I asked Beckett how Nadine had located a licensed doctor prepared to risk his credentials on a fabricated document. Beckett laid out the social architecture of their world. Nadine had spent years building relationships at the Cedar Brook Country Club, buying her way into a network of wealthy influence using money stolen from a dying woman's care fund. Dr. Quill was a regular presence at those exclusive gatherings. He operated a boutique wellness clinic that served executives who required discreet prescriptions and questionable medical waivers. He had a long history of bending professional standards for money. Nadine had deployed her remaining social capital to persuade him that I was genuinely senile and the paperwork was a simple family protection formality. He had signed the affidavit without once setting eyes on me, operating on the assumption that an old man living above a dry cleaner would never command the resources to challenge a wealthy physician's professional opinion. It was a fatal miscalculation rooted entirely in arrogance. Beckett leaned forward and set his hands flat on the desk. This was no longer a civil matter over unpaid rent or unauthorized transfers from a bank account. Submitting a fabricated medical affidavit to a federal judge for the purpose of seizing a senior citizen's assets was perjury, a serious felony. They had moved from entitled thieves into the territory of criminals willing to strip away a man's fundamental rights to preserve their lifestyle. If the judge granted the temporary order, Derek would gain instant access to the offshore accounts and the power to void the eviction notice. I asked Beckett what our immediate response should be. He told me we could file a motion to dismiss and expose the forged affidavit right now, stop the hearing before it started. But he did not want to stop the hearing. He wanted them to walk into that courtroom and enter the fraudulent document into the official record themselves. He wanted them to commit perjury on the open record in front of a judge. To make that trap work, we needed an airtight defense. Beckett directed me to leave his office and drive straight to the State Medical University Hospital. He had already arranged an appointment with the head of the neurology department, a highly respected specialist who regularly served as an expert witness in complex estate litigation. I was to sit for a comprehensive psychiatric and cognitive evaluation. We needed proof that was absolute and unassailable. I left Beckett's law firm and drove to the hospital. I spent 4 hours in a sterile examination room. I brought to that evaluation the same exacting discipline I once applied to calculating the tensile strength of a suspension bridge. Every cognitive test they placed in front of me, I completed. Spatial reasoning puzzles solved without error. Complex numerical sequences recalled from memory. Detailed questions about my financial records, my corporate structures, and the precise dates of my long-term investment positions, all answered without hesitation. My mind is a fortress of logic and mathematics. There are no fractures in the cognitive foundation. The neurologist reviewed my results without a word. He looked at my scores, then looked at me with genuine professional respect. My cognitive function, he told me, was not simply normal for a man of my age. It was exceptional. He produced a comprehensive 20-page report certifying full mental clarity and total executive function. The official seal of the university hospital went on it, and his signature followed in heavy authoritative ink. I carried the sealed report back to Beckett's office that afternoon and laid it on the mahogany desk alongside the fraudulent affidavit Derek had purchased. The contrast between the two documents was the difference between a solid concrete foundation and a pillar of crumbling sand. Beckett showed the cold, thin smile of a man watching a well-engineered outcome arrive on schedule. He placed both documents into his leather briefcase. Then he laid out the demolition timeline. The emergency hearing was set for the following Tuesday morning. Derek and Nadine were convinced they had caught me flat-footed. They believed their high-priced attorney and their bought medical paperwork would be more than enough to persuade a judge to strip away my rights and hand them the keys to everything I had built. They assumed I was huddled in my little apartment, rattled and disoriented by the legal broadside they had launched. What they had absolutely no idea about was that we were perfectly content to let them excavate their own graves in front of a magistrate. I left the office and made my way back to the apartment. As city lights began slicing through the winter dark, the cold air bleeding through the floorboards of my aging work van felt anchoring somehow. I turned over in my mind the sheer moral rot required to attempt a move like that. Derek was prepared to have his own father committed to a psychiatric ward just to hold on to his leased cars and his country club membership. He was willing to erase me from the legal map to preserve his lifestyle. Whatever faint traces of parental grief remained in my chest burned away completely. There was nothing left to grieve because the son I believed I had raised simply did not exist. What stood in his place was a malicious liability, one that needed to be permanently liquidated. I climbed the narrow wooden stairs and let myself inside. I sat down at the kitchen table and watched the blinking red light of my security camera. The game had moved into different territory now. This was a fight for my survival. They had worked to cast me as a shattered, helpless old man. They were about to discover that a master architect never raises a structure without also engineering the means to bring it down. I drank a glass of water and got ready for the courtroom. The heavy oak doors of the county courthouse were solid and gave nothing. I pushed through them with Beckett moving in perfect sync beside me. The polished marble floors sent our footsteps echoing back at us. It was a sound I recognized from decades of walking through municipal buildings on inspection. I understand exactly how institutions are constructed. I understand how the weight of authority is arranged across a room to unsettle anyone who hasn't learned to read the architecture of power. I had not come here today to be unsettled. I had come to watch my son try to turn the legal system into a weapon and watch it blow up in his face. We found the courtroom assigned to emergency hearings. The air was stale dense with nervous energy. Derek and Nadine were already at the petitioner's table. They had brought in a man named Holt to represent them. Holt was a predatory family law attorney, expensive suits, a reputation built on burying elderly defendants under mountains of aggressive paperwork. He was whispering rapidly into Derek's ear as we crossed the room to our table. Derek glanced up and found my eyes. He gave me a slow, patronizing smile. He was certain the winning hand was in his grip. He trusted that the fraudulent medical document his country club doctor had signed was an unbreakable lock on this whole proceeding. The magistrate entered and took her seat at the high bench. She was a stern woman, sharp eyes, a well-known appetite for zero tolerance when it came to frivolous filings. She opened the file and read out the emergency petition for temporary guardianship. She looked down at me, then across to Derek. She directed Holt's team to justify their attempt to strip a competent adult of his fundamental autonomy. Holt rose, smoothed his lapels, and spoke with a carefully rehearsed theatrical sorrow. He told the magistrate this was a tragic case of rapid cognitive decline. He claimed I was in the grip of aggressive early-onset dementia. He drew a portrait of a confused paranoid father who had inexplicably turned against the loving family around him. He pointed to the frozen bank accounts and the eviction notice as ironclad proof of mental deterioration. He argued that no father in his right mind would put his own son out into the winter cold. He insisted I was a danger to myself, and that immediate legal intervention was the only thing standing between me and the ruin of my own estate. To drive the point home, Holt produced the fraudulent affidavit. He handed it to the court clerk. He announced with unmistakable pride that it bore the signature of Dr. Quill, a prominent local physician. The document certified that I lacked the executive function to manage my own finances and required immediate protective custody. Nadine sat next to Derek, dabbing at dry eyes with a tissue. It was a flawless performance of suburban grief. They had constructed an airtight story, a devoted young family doing what had to be done for a sick old man. The magistrate reviewed the affidavit without a word. The courtroom went still. Derek leaned back in his chair and folded his arms across his chest. He looked at me with the expression of a man who believed the demolition was already complete. He thought he had already pried my life savings from my hands. The magistrate raised her eyes and directed her attention to Beckett. She asked whether the respondent wished to address the court before she ruled on the emergency motion. Beckett rose slowly. He carried none of the frantic theatrical energy radiating from the opposing table. He moved with the quiet, deliberate economy of a predator closing the final distance. He buttoned his jacket and spoke to the magistrate directly. He told her we had no intention of engaging with the emotional framing of the petitioner's claims. We are only interested, he said, in the structural integrity of their evidence. Beckett walked to the clerk's desk and asked to examine the affidavit Holt had submitted. He studied the signature, then shook his head with the kind of mild professional disgust that needed no elaboration. He turned back to face the magistrate. He informed the court that I had never been a patient of Dr. Quill, not for a consultation, not for an examination, not for so much as a passing conversation. Beckett asked the magistrate to note the exact date and time stamped on the affidavit. It had been executed precisely 12 hours after I served Derek and Nadine with a formal 30-day eviction notice. Holt was on his feet immediately. He accused us of defaming a respected medical professional and insisted the assessment was valid, grounded in extensive family interviews. Beckett paid the outburst no attention whatsoever. He reached into his leather briefcase and withdrew a thick-bound folder carrying the official seal of the State Medical University Hospital. He approached the bench and placed it directly before the magistrate. He explained that we had anticipated this precise, desperate maneuver. He told the court that 48 hours earlier, I had undergone a comprehensive, grueling cognitive and psychiatric evaluation, not administered by a boutique wellness doctor looking for a quick paycheck from a country club connection, but by the head of the neurology department at the state's leading research hospital. The magistrate opened the folder. The silence that followed deepened until it felt heavy enough to compress the breath from my son's lungs. I watched her work through the detailed 20-page report. It certified my perfect spatial reasoning. It certified my flawless memory recall. It certified my complete and unyielding mental clarity. The neurologist had concluded explicitly that I possessed total executive function and performed at a cognitive level exceptional for a man of any age. The color drained entirely from Derek's face. That smug smile of his fractured and fell apart. Nadine stopped working the tissue against her dry eyes and fixed her stare on the thick medical report sitting on the judge's desk. In that moment, they understood their cheap forgery had been utterly eclipsed by an unassailable mountain of legitimate scientific evidence. The magistrate set down the file and looked directly at Holt. Her eyes were hard and offered nothing. She asked the attorney to explain how his client had secured a diagnosis of severe dementia from a physician who had never physically laid eyes on the patient, while the state's leading neurologist had simultaneously certified that same patient as perfectly healthy. Holt stuttered. The smooth, arrogant rhythm of his delivery evaporated. He looked to Derek for help, but Derek was staring at the floor. Holt tried to reverse course. He stammered that his clients had acted in good faith, guided by the behavioral changes they had personally witnessed. He attempted to frame the eviction notice as the source of their genuine concern for my welfare. The magistrate cut him off. Her voice carried through the marble room without effort. She stated that the petition was not an act of family concern. She declared it a transparent and malicious attempt to retaliate against a lawful eviction. She noted the deeply suspicious timing, pointing out that their sudden alarm over my mental health had only surfaced the moment their free housing and their access to stolen money were revoked. She turned her gaze on Derek and Nadine. She told them she found their conduct deeply disturbing. She stated that attempting to weaponize the guardianship system as a workaround to a legal eviction was a severe abuse of judicial process. She informed them that submitting an unverified medical document to seize control of another person's assets bordered on criminal fraud. The magistrate announced that the emergency petition for guardianship was dismissed with prejudice. She explicitly ordered that no further petitions of this kind could be filed without a court-appointed independent medical examiner. She then turned her attention directly to Holt and suggested he counsel his clients to prepare for the serious legal consequences of filing a fraudulent affidavit under oath. The hearing was over. The counterstrike had landed with precision. We had not merely held the fortress, we had destroyed their siege engines and scattered everything they brought against us. Beckett packed his briefcase with slow, deliberate movements. Holt did not stay a moment longer than necessary. He swept his papers together in a frenzy and moved quickly toward the exit, leaving his clients stranded at the table. He understood that his reputation had just taken serious damage from their lies, and he wanted to put distance between himself and the wreckage to come. I rose and buttoned my coat. I looked across the room at my son. Derek was shaking. His hands were clamped to the edge of the table, hard enough to drain the color from his knuckles. He was pulling in short, shallow breaths. The full weight of what had just happened was finally pressing down on his chest. He had played his last card. He had tried to erase me from the legal record, and he had failed publicly, completely, and on the record. Nadine did not look at me. She stared straight ahead, her face locked in rigid shock. The Cedarbrook Country Club connections had been worth nothing. Her contempt for my intelligence had destroyed her. They had just over 3 weeks left in the house, and no access to the money needed to find another. I walked past their table without a word. There was nothing remaining to say. The emotional bond had been severed long before today, and the legal bond was now officially gone with it. I pushed through the heavy oak doors and stepped out into the biting winter morning. The air hit sharp and clean. Beckett walked alongside me. The predatory satisfaction of a complete courtroom victory settled across his face. We crossed the parking lot without speaking. The second phase of the demolition was finished. The house was secured. My autonomy was intact, but the crimes at the foundation of all this were still waiting to be answered for. The $500 drained every month from a dying woman's medical fund. The $45,000 fraudulent credit line forged to build a luxury patio. The civil matters were closed, but the criminal liabilities were ripe and ready to be collected. I unlocked my aging work van and got in. I looked out at Beckett standing on the frozen pavement. I told him it was time to move into the final phase. Time to put the forged signature and the audio recordings of their violent threats directly into the hands of the federal authorities. Beckett nodded. The mask had slipped, the trap had closed, and now the full crushing weight of the law was about to come to rest on my son's shoulders. I turned the key and pulled away from the courthouse, leaving the wreckage of Derek's arrogance behind me. The family court victory was a structural clearing, nothing more. We had stripped away the rubble of their false medical claims, but the underlying theft was still unresolved. The $45,000 fraudulent credit line was a loaded weapon sitting on the table. Derek had forged my signature to pull those funds. Beckett and I sat in his corner office watching snow collect against the glass. I told him I had no interest in a quiet settlement. I wanted the federal authorities to take my son apart piece by piece. Beckett poured a glass of water and walked me through the final maneuver. We needed Derek to commit a federal crime on camera in front of witnesses. Beckett drafted a settlement offer. It was a masterpiece of legal bait. The document stated that I would halt the eviction and legally forgive the stolen hospice funds in exchange for Derek signing a sworn admission. That admission required him to acknowledge he had opened the $45,000 credit line without my authorization and agree to a firm repayment schedule. Beckett emailed the proposal to Holt. Holt immediately forwarded it to his client and withdrew as their legal counsel. The family court catastrophe had shaken him badly. Derek was now completely on his own, without legal cover of any kind. I sat in my apartment watching the security feeds from my hidden cameras. I knew Derek could never put his name on that admission. A sworn acknowledgement of unauthorized credit extension was a written confession to wire fraud. But refusing the settlement meant he would be physically removed from that house in 20 days. His back was flat against a concrete wall. He had no money to bring in a new attorney. Desperation has always been one of the most reliable engines of catastrophic mistakes. 2 days went by in silence. On the morning of January 8th, my phone buzzed. A direct message from Derek. He told me he was ready to settle the whole matter. He asked for a meeting at Beckett's office that afternoon. He said he had a counterproposal that could resolve the financial issues without requiring him to acknowledge any criminal liability. I called Beckett and told him to activate every recording device in the building. The prey was walking straight through the front door. I arrived at Beckett's law firm an hour ahead of time. Beckett and I ran through the audio feeds and confirmed the cloud storage connection was live. The cameras were completely out of sight, tucked inside smoke detectors and hidden behind the thick spines of legal encyclopedias on the bookshelf. Every word spoken in that room was about to become permanent federal evidence. At exactly 3:00, the lobby's heavy glass doors swung open. Derek came in wearing a wrinkled suit. The commanding posture he usually carried was gone, entirely replaced by a jittery, perspiring energy. He hadn't come alone. Moving alongside him was a thin man with a worn leather briefcase. The man had on a cheap gray suit and kept his eyes away from the receptionist. I knew immediately he was not an attorney. A real lawyer walks into a room with a certain weight to his presence. This man moved like something that hugs the baseboards. Beckett brought them into the corner office and closed the door. The soundproofing swallowed the noise of the city outside, leaving the room in complete silence. I sat across the mahogany desk and studied my son. His eyes were bloodshot. There was a faint smell of stale alcohol and cheap cologne about him. He didn't look at me. He fixed his gaze on Beckett and announced that he was rejecting our settlement offer. Beckett leaned back in his chair and asked Derek how he planned to halt the eviction and resolve the $45,000 fraud investigation without putting his name on the agreement. Derek smirked. It was a thin, unsteady shadow of his old arrogance. He told Beckett there was no fraud investigation because there had been no fraud. He stated that I had voluntarily granted him full financial authority over all my accounts a year ago. He claimed he had the legal paperwork to back it up. He turned toward the thin man beside him. Derek introduced him as Dex. He described Dex as an independent notary public and a private financial auditor. Dex opened his worn leather briefcase and set a single sheet of heavy paper on Beckett's desk. He pushed the document across the polished surface. I looked down at it. It was a general power of attorney. The document explicitly granted Derek total control over my banking profiles, my credit lines, and my corporate assets. The text stated I had authorized him to execute loans and manage my estate on account of my declining health. The date at the top had been stamped exactly 14 months prior. At the bottom of the page was my signature. It was the same sloppy, erratic forgery I had already seen on the bank loan application. The loops were too wide, the pressure all wrong. Beside the forged signature sat a blue notary stamp bearing Dex's name, confirming that he had personally watched me sign the document 14 months ago. The audacity of the move was staggering. Derek had recognized he couldn't outrun the forgery charge, so he had chosen to double down. He had brought in a black market document forger to construct a retroactive legal shield. He believed this fabricated power of attorney would retroactively legitimize the stolen credit line and compel me to abandon the eviction. Beckett lifted the document and examined it with absolute professional detachment. He looked at Dex. He asked Dex directly whether he held a valid notary license in the state. Dex swallowed hard and nodded. He said his license was current. Beckett asked him to confirm for the record that he was physically present in this room 14 months ago and personally witnessed me execute the power of attorney. Dex looked over at Derek. Derek gave him a sharp, desperate nod. Dex turned back to Beckett and stated clearly that he had verified my identification himself and watched me put my signature on that page on that exact date. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. The trap had snapped completely shut. Beckett set the forged document gently back on the desk. He laced his fingers together and directed his attention to Dex. He asked Dex whether he understood the federal penalties for forging a legal instrument used to conceal bank fraud. Dex shifted in his chair. He stammered that he was only a notary and the document was entirely legitimate. I leaned forward and spoke for the first time since they had walked in. I told Dex that 14 months ago, I was standing on a steel scaffold in a neighboring state overseeing the emergency reinforcement of a commercial bridge. I laid it out plainly. On the exact date stamped on that fraudulent document, I was surrounded by 40 union steelworkers and a team of county inspectors for 14 consecutive hours. I had the payroll records, hotel receipts, and government inspection logs to place me there with precision. The blood drained out of Dex's face completely. He looked down at his cheap shoes, then toward the door. He understood he had just walked into a fatal ambush. Beckett gave them no room to breathe. He leveled a finger at Dex and laid out the exact shape of the situation. He told the forger that producing a fabricated legal instrument to extract a settlement and bury a federal banking crime was a serious felony. He stated that conspiracy to commit wire fraud carried a minimum mandatory sentence in a federal penitentiary. Beckett then tilted his gaze toward the ceiling and addressed the hidden microphones directly. He stated for the record that the entire exchange had been captured in high-definition audio and video. He informed them that the footage was already sitting on a secure server, accessible only to the federal authorities. Derek launched out of his chair. The leg scraped hard against the floor. He lunged across the desk, reaching for the forged power of attorney. Pure blind panic. He was trying to destroy the physical evidence before it could be used against him. I was on my feet instantly. I caught his wrist before his fingers made contact with the paper. 40 years of gripping steel cables and torquing heavy iron bolts had left my hands with a particular kind of strength. I locked his arm in place with a vice grip. Derek gasped and buckled to his knees. He looked up at me with wide, frightened eyes. I looked down at the son who had left me standing in the freezing rain. I looked at the man who had taken money meant to bring his dying mother some comfort. I told him the game was finished, permanently. I told him there were no more documents to buy and no more doctors to corrupt. He had just committed a federal crime inside a law firm in full view of surveillance cameras on every wall. Dex did not wait to be dismissed. He scrambled from his chair, left his leather briefcase sitting on the floor, and bolted through the heavy glass doors. He sprinted down the hallway, desperate to put distance between himself and the wreckage of my son's catastrophic decisions. Beckett made no move to stop him. The briefcase contained all of Dex's forging equipment and notary logs. The authorities would have him in hand within hours. I released Derek's wrist. He fell back onto the carpet, clutching his arm to his chest. He started to hyperventilate. The polished suburban facade had burned away completely, leaving nothing behind but a desperate criminal sitting on the floor of a law office. He begged me to wipe the footage. He promised he would pack his things and be out of the house by nightfall. He He swore he would never come near me again, just let him walk out the door. I moved around the desk and picked up the forged document. I folded it with care and slipped it into my coat pocket. I looked down at the man falling apart on the carpet. I told him I had no intention of deleting anything. I told him that an architect does not halt a demolition simply because the structure pleads for mercy. The building had been corrupt from the foundation up, and the charges had already been set off. Beckett lifted his office phone and dialed a direct number. He asked for the federal prosecutor assigned to financial crimes. The civil chapter was closed. The criminal prosecution had begun. I walked out of that corner office and left my son sobbing on the floor as the machinery of the federal government started to move toward him. The extraction was complete. The disease had been cut cleanly out of my life. I stepped out into the frozen city streets and let the cold air fill my lungs. The sky was clear, the horizon unobstructed in every direction. The drive away from the law firm felt nothing like the drive there. The winter air pushed through the vents of my aging work van, but it carried no bitterness this time. It felt like something being washed clean. The architecture of my son's deception had been hollowed out entirely. There was no foundation left to hold up his arrogance. Beckett had made the call to the federal prosecutor, but what had actually unfolded was far more layered than a single phone call could explain. We had not stumbled into a lucky break with the notary. The man named Dex was never a genuine threat to my autonomy. He was a demolition charge placed by the authorities long before Derek ever brought him through the doors of Beckett's law firm. Beckett had known exactly who Dex was the moment he set that forged document on the mahogany desk. The federal authorities had been tracking a sophisticated document fraud ring operating in the city for over 8 months. Dex had been caught forging commercial real estate deeds earlier in the year. Facing decades in a federal penitentiary, he had agreed to serve as an active informant. He wore a concealed recording device to every meeting. He logged every illicit transaction. When Derek went hunting for a black market professional to fabricate my medical records and power of attorney, he unknowingly retained a man who was actively working for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The story of Dex and his arrangement with the federal government was a masterpiece of legal engineering. When Derek first went looking for a forger, he reached out to a shady contractor he had used before on unpermitted remodeling work. That contractor passed him a prepaid phone number. Derek believed he was being extraordinarily careful. He believed he was moving through the deep shadows of the criminal underworld. In reality, he was dialing straight into a federal switchboard. Dex had been instructed by his handlers to fulfill every request Derek brought to him. When Derek asked for a backdated power of attorney, Dex delivered it without a hesitation. When Nadine pushed for a fabricated psychiatric evaluation carrying the signature of a compromised physician, Dex handed over the document without a second thought. The federal agents had told Dex to let my son's arrogance set the tempo of the operation. They understood that people who feel entitled rarely see danger coming because they are convinced the rules were never written with them in mind. The $50,000 Derek transferred to Dex to secure these forged documents was the nail that sealed the coffin. He didn't use cash. He used the fraudulent $45,000 credit line he had opened in my name, moving the funds across state lines through digital banking applications. That single action triggered the federal wire fraud statutes. It took what had been a local case of elder abuse and turned it into a major federal prosecution built around the digital transmission of stolen funds. The federal agents traced the money's digital footprint as it traveled from the bank server directly into evidence accounts controlled by the Bureau. The chain of custody was flawless. Every panicked phone call Derek made to coordinate the forgery had been recorded. Every demand Nadine made to rush the fake psychiatric evaluation had been logged and transcribed by federal agents. They had effectively produced their own documentary of their criminal conspiracy. The meeting in Beckett's office was simply the final piece of corroborating evidence the prosecutor needed before executing the warrants. The hammer dropped 48 hours later. A bitterly cold Thursday morning. The suburban neighborhood where Derek and Nadine lived was quiet and immaculate. The manicured lawns lay buried beneath a clean blanket of white snow. The residents of the gated community were sipping expensive coffee and easing into their comfortable corporate routines. That immaculate calm shattered at precisely 6:00 in the morning. I had no need to be present. Beckett walked me through every detail later that afternoon. Three dark sport utility vehicles swung into the wide circular driveway of the five-bedroom Craftsman. A dozen federal agents in heavy tactical vests stepped out onto the frozen pavement. They did not knock. They did not wait for Nadine to reach for her designer clothes. They took the heavy oak front door off with a steel ram. The sound rolled through the entire subdivision, jolting the neighbors awake and triggering a cascade of security alarms. Derek was pulled from his bed. The man who had spent 4 years treating me as something disposable was made to stand in his grand foyer in his sleepwear. His hands were secured behind his back with steel cuffs. Nadine was escorted down the sweeping staircase by two female agents. The carefully constructed image of suburban superiority she had spent years building was gone in an instant. She was weeping without control as the agents read through the list of charges. The neighbors pressed against their windows and gathered on their porches to watch as the golden couple of the neighborhood was walked out into the freezing cold. The charges the federal agents read aloud were extensive and absolutely devastating. Conspiracy to commit medical document fraud, aggravated identity theft, federal wire fraud, attempted extortion. The $50,000 they had funneled to the informant pushed the charges to a level that guaranteed a lengthy mandatory sentence. They were loaded into the back of the federal vehicles and driven away from the property they had worked so ruthlessly to take. The agents didn't stop at arresting my son and his wife. They executed a total asset seizure. The leased black luxury sedans sitting in the garage were impounded. The expensive furniture and artwork throughout the house were cataloged and frozen by the authorities as proceeds of financial crimes. The house itself remained untouched only because my corporate entity held the clean legal deed. Every single thing Derek and Nadine claimed as their own was stripped away within a matter of hours. The parasitic growth had been completely cut from the host. By noon, the local news networks had the story on the air. A prominent suburban couple conspiring to have an elderly father declared mentally incompetent in order to plunder his life savings. It was too sensational to pass up. Nadine lost her position at the corporate firm before the sun went down. Her partners cut all ties immediately to insulate themselves from the reputational damage. Derek was banned from the Cedarbrook Country Club the moment his mugshot appeared on the screens in their private lounge. The social world they had sacrificed everything to inhabit rejected them without hesitation and without mercy. I sat in my small apartment above the dry cleaner and watched the report unfold on my small television. I watched the helicopter footage showing federal vehicles parked in the driveway of the house I had purchased. I watched reporters standing in the snow and walking through the precise mechanics of the fraud. I felt no pity. Pity belongs to those who meet disaster by accident. This was not an accident. This was a mathematical certainty. You do not raise a heavy structure on a rotting foundation and then act surprised when it comes apart. Beckett called me later that evening. He told me bail had been denied. The federal magistrate determined that Derek and Nadine posed a severe flight risk given their documented willingness to fabricate legal instruments and siphon substantial sums of money. They would stay in federal custody until their trial date. Beckett informed me that their assigned public defenders had already reached out looking to discuss a plea arrangement. They wanted to limit the prison exposure. Beckett told me the prosecutor had no intention of extending leniency. The evidence was too complete and the crime too repugnant for that. I thought about the breathtaking vanity required to execute such a sloppy plan. Derek and Nadine had spent their entire adult lives drawing quietly on my financial support to sustain their illusion of success. They had grown so comfortable with my compliance that they forgot entirely what I was. They forgot I was an engineer. They forgot I had spent 4 decades designing structures built to hold against hurricanes and earthquakes. They came at me with cheap paper and careless lies. They brought a sledgehammer to demolish a titanium vault. Now they were staring into the machinery of the federal justice system. The prosecutors would take apart every dimension of their lives with systematic precision. The luxury cars, the country club, memberships, the designer wardrobes, and the carefully curated social status. All of it gone permanently. They would spend the next decade inside a federal facility, thinking back to the exact moment they decided to put an old man out in the freezing rain. The controlled demolition was finished. The dust had settled, and the site was clear. The son who had locked me out in the cold to preserve his lifestyle was now locked inside a concrete cell. The woman who had once ridiculed my worn clothes was wearing a standard-issue prison uniform. The money they had bled from my late wife's hospice fund, would be extracted from them slowly and painfully through years of federal restitution orders. I switched off the television and moved to my quiet kitchen. I poured a glass of cold water and stood looking out at the dark city. The winter storm had cleared, the sky was open, and the stars were plainly visible above the skyline. The structural integrity of my life had been fully restored. The blueprints were clean. The foundation was solid steel. I drank the water and sat with the absolute unbroken silence. The wheels of federal justice grind slowly, but corporate finance moves with a terrifying mechanical speed. The moment the federal agents froze the offshore accounts and seized the physical assets, the bank initiated foreclosure proceedings on the suburban house. Derek had not made a legitimate mortgage payment in 6 months. He had been keeping the illusion of ownership alive entirely through fraudulent credit lines and money drained from my accounts. When Beckett delivered the verified wire fraud evidence to the loan officers, the bank voided the remaining grace periods without delay. The eviction notice was no longer a family dispute. It was a binding mandate from a major financial institution. The bank's executives looked at the federal indictments pending against my son and concluded that their collateral was in serious jeopardy. They moved to reclaim the property with the kind of cold corporate efficiency that answers to no one. The morning of the eviction was brutally cold. The sky was a solid sheet of gray, reflecting the absolute finality of what was about to happen. Winter frost gripped the manicured lawns of the subdivision like a heavy, suffocating layer. I parked my aging work van halfway down the street from the house. The neighborhood was fully awake. The wealthy residents of the gated community had taken up positions on their porches and behind their bay windows. The suburban ecosystem demands a certain performance of success, and it expels anyone who shatters the illusion without remorse. Derek and Nadine were no longer the golden couple of the neighborhood. They had become something to be quarantined, and the community had assembled to observe the process. People who had cheerfully attended their dinner parties now stood with arms folded, speaking in low voices to one another. The social currency Nadine had purchased with my stolen money was worth nothing. 2 heavy white vans from the county sheriff's department turned into the wide circular driveway. 4 deputies climbed out onto the frozen concrete. They moved without anger or malice. They carried the cold, bureaucratic efficiency of men who handle evictions every single day of the week. They walked to the heavy oak front door and knocked with force. The sound carried down the quiet street and cut through the freezing wind. The bank had taken formal possession of the property. Every piece of expensive furniture, every designer garment, every luxury appliance inside that house was now frozen collateral tied to the federal fraud investigation. Derek and Nadine were permitted to leave only with the clothes on their backs and whatever personal items could fit inside a single standard cardboard box. The life they had assembled on stolen money was being inventoried and claimed by the state. The deputies stepped inside the grand foyer. 20 minutes passed in complete tense silence. The neighbors pulled their expensive coats closer against the freezing wind and refused to look away. Finally, Nadine came through the door. She was unrecognizable. The polished, imperious woman who had ridiculed my worn corduroy shirts and expected my total submission had vanished entirely. She had on plain gray sweatpants and a heavy winter jacket. Her face was pale and bare-stripped of the expensive layer of makeup she had always used as armor. She held a small brown box pressed tightly against her chest. She moved down the long brick path, with her head-lowered eyes fixed on the frozen ground below her feet. She did not look at the deputies on the porch. She did not look at the neighbors watching from their lawns. She looked like a hollow figure drifting through the wreckage of a life that no longer existed. Derek came out a few moments behind her. A tall deputy walked close at his shoulder, making certain he did not pause or attempt to go back inside. Derek was carrying nothing. His hands were empty and buried in his coat pockets. He had on an old dark jacket and heavy work boots. His posture was entirely broken. The broad, intimidating set of his shoulders, the ones he had used to push his way through life, were hunched severely inward. The accumulated weight of federal indictments, a ruined career, and total public disgrace had compressed him. He caught the edge of the bottom porch step and stumbled. The deputy made no move to steady him. The officer simply pointed a gloved hand toward the street and directed him to vacate the premises immediately and permanently. I stood on the sidewalk next to the frozen trunk of an old elm tree, hands resting quietly in my coat pockets. I did not move as they made their way down the long driveway. I simply watched the structural collapse reach its final conclusion. Derek raised his head and saw me standing there in the cold. His bloodshot eyes found my face. He stopped walking. The deputy behind him told him to keep moving, but Derek planted his feet on the concrete. He stared at me with an expression of pure, agonizing clarity. He understood in that exact moment that none of this was bad luck or a temporary reversal. Every terrible thing descending on him was the direct mathematical result of his own actions. He had reached for the foundation beneath my feet and had successfully demolished his own world in the process. He took a hesitant step in my direction, his mouth opened. I have no idea what he meant to say. Whether he was going to beg for a place to sleep or pour his final resentments into the winter air, I cannot tell you. It made no difference either way. I did not give him a single word of comfort. I did not give him condemnation or rage. I looked at the boy I had raised the man, who had coolly planned to have me confined to a psychiatric ward for a few $1,000s, and I gave him absolutely nothing. The silence between us was a wall of solid steel with no seam to find. I am an engineer. I know precisely how much load a bearing beam can carry before the stress fractures it. I had been carrying the weight of his entitlement and his cruelty for decades. I had absorbed the financial damage and the emotional neglect, believing that a solid enough foundation might eventually bring a warped structure into alignment. But the beam had snapped. There was nothing left to repair. A bridge that has gone into the river cannot be wished back into the sky. It has to be cleared away so the water can move freely again. Derek read the absolute finality written in my eyes. Whatever faint spark of defiance was left in him extinguished completely. He closed his mouth and dropped his head. He turned away and walked slowly down the street, trailing behind his weeping wife into the biting wind. They had no vehicles left to drive, no money hidden in private accounts, no one remaining at the prestigious country club who would risk answering their calls. They were moving toward a public bus stop on the outer edge of the subdivision, beginning a long and unforgiving passage into the federal justice system. I turned my attention back to the property. The deputies had completed a thorough sweep of the interior. A bank representative came up the driveway, carrying a heavy metal lockbox and a thick steel chain. He secured the grand front doors and clamped the lockbox to the polished brass handle. He drove a bright yellow foreclosure notice into the frozen earth beside the brick mailbox. The legal notice snapped and shuddered in the cold wind. The house was no longer a monument to stolen wealth or suburban superiority. It was an empty, dark shell waiting to be liquidated by the bank to offset the massive fraudulent debts attached to it. The neighbors began drifting back to the warmth of their own secure and legitimately held homes. The spectacle was over. The subdivision had finished purging the financial infection from its streets. I stood on the sidewalk a few moments longer, listening to the wind move through the bare branches of the tall elm trees. The natural order had been fully restored. The parasites had been removed, and the host had survived. I walked back to my aging work van and settled into the cold cabin. I started the engine and ran the heater on high, letting the warm air work slowly through my frozen fingers. I thought about the thick legal files on Beckett's mahogany desk. I thought about the federal prosecutors assembling the wire fraud and conspiracy indictments. The criminal machinery would keep turning without any further involvement from me. My quiet, necessary work in the shadows was done. I put the van in gear and drove slowly out of the gated community. I did not check the mirror as I rounded the corner. I left the towering craftsman and the yellow foreclosure notice behind me without looking back. I drove toward the city, toward my small, quiet apartment above the dry cleaner. It was modest and tight, but resting on a foundation of absolute truth and honest work. I had protected my legacy and reclaimed my personal honor. I watched the gray city skyline rise through the windshield, entirely satisfied by the beautiful, unyielding mathematics of justice. The state criminal courthouse was built from heavy blocks of gray limestone. It had been designed to resemble a fortress of absolute accountability. I walked up the wide concrete steps with Beckett at my side. The winter wind had finally gone still, leaving the morning air motionless and bitterly cold. I have spent my entire life reading the integrity of large structures. I understand that a building designed to administer justice must feel immovably heavy. It must make clear to the guilty that the walls confining them are beyond manipulation. Derek and Nadine had moved through every environment they entered, like a hand through water, bending things to their will. Today they were stepping into a structure that would not bend. We took our seats in the front row of the gallery directly behind the prosecutor's table. The courtroom was paneled in dark wood and lit with flat fluorescent light. A heavy wooden door along the side wall opened, and two county bailiffs escorted my son and his wife into the room. I studied the people who had tried to erase my legal existence. Every layer of purchased armor had been stripped away. Derek wore a loose orange custody uniform that swallowed his frame. His broad shoulders were rounded and caved inward. He moved across the linoleum floor with a slow shuffle, his eyes fixed on the polished wooden surface of the defense table. Nadine came in just behind him. The woman who had once stood in my kitchen and ridiculed my worn corduroy shirts was now dressed in the exact same cheap orange fabric. Her hair was pulled back tight, and her face had been drained of every trace of color. The Cedarbrook Country Club socialite had been reduced to a state inmate. They sat at the defense table without a word. They did not turn to face the gallery. They did not look for friendly faces because they understood that none remained. Every connection they had maintained on my stolen money had dissolved the moment the federal indictments became public. The judge entered and took his position at the high bench. He was a seasoned jurist with a reputation for merciless efficiency. The trial was going to be brief. There was no need for theatrical performance. The evidence was simply irrefutable. The lead prosecutor rose and addressed the court. She did not raise her voice or reach for manufactured emotion. She laid out the chronological architecture of their crimes with plain precision. She explained how Derek and Nadine had drained a dying woman's medical fund to underwrite their luxury lifestyle. She detailed the $45,000 fraudulent credit line opened to build a patio. The defense attorney attempted to cut in. He tried to build a narrative of financial desperation, that his clients had been overwhelmed by the mounting costs of suburban life, and had made poor impulsive decisions under severe pressure. The prosecutor took it apart immediately. She stated that desperation does not account for premeditated conspiracy. She produced the banking records showing the precise moment Derek transferred $50,000 of stolen funds to a known federal informant. She laid out how that money was used to procure a fabricated psychiatric evaluation and a forged power of attorney. She pointed directly at Derek and told the court that these were not impulsive choices, they were calculated steps designed to have a perfectly sane man imprisoned. The prosecution then played the audio recordings captured by the hidden cameras inside Beckett's office. The voices of my son and his wife filled the courtroom. The judge listened as Derek presented the forged documents with full confidence. He listened as Nadine demanded the eviction be suspended in exchange for my physical freedom. The malice in their voices was sharpened by the hard acoustics of the room. Reading a transcript of a crime is one thing. Hearing the raw, unguarded arrogance of two people dismantling a family member for financial gain is something else entirely. The defense attorney lowered his head and set down his pen. He understood that the structural integrity of his case had given way completely under the weight of the audio evidence. The prosecutor called me to the witness stand. I walked past the defense table without looking at Derek or Nadine. I took my seat and swore to tell the truth. The prosecutor asked me to describe the events of Christmas Eve. I sat in the wooden chair and spoke with absolute mechanical precision. I described how I stood on their porch in the freezing rain. I explained how my son looked directly at me and pulled the heavy front door shut to protect his holiday party from the embarrassment of my presence. I told the court how they later tried to weaponize that exact act of cruelty as fabricated medical proof of my dementia. I recalled a summer afternoon, many decades back, when Derek was still a young boy. I had brought him out to a construction site to show him how a concrete foundation gets poured. I told him that day that a single critical mistake at the base of a structure will eventually bring the whole thing down. I told him that gravity has no tolerance for a lie. He hadn't listened to me then, and he had burned his entire adult life trying to defy that simple truth. I looked squarely at the judge and stated that my son had constructed his whole existence on a foundation of theft and manipulation. I made clear that I took no pleasure in watching his destruction, but I refused to let him treat my life as raw material for his own survival. The defense attorney chose not to cross-examine me. There were no cracks in my testimony for anyone to pry open. I stepped down from the stand and returned to my seat beside Beckett. The trial drove hard toward its inevitable end. The prosecution rested, and the defense offered not a single witness. They had nothing left to put forward. The fraudulent medical records, the forged power of attorney, and the recorded extortion attempts had assembled an inescapable steel cage around the defendants. The judge required no lengthy deliberation. He looked down at the documents spread across his bench, then raised his eyes and fixed them squarely on Derek and Nadine. The courtroom was so still, I could make out the faint hum of the heating vents. He stated that in his 30 years on the bench, he had seldom encountered a case of elder abuse so thoroughly documented and so deliberately vicious. He addressed Nadine first. He told her that draining the medical funds of a dying woman to bankroll a country club lifestyle was an act of profound moral depravity. He then turned his full attention to Derek. He told my son that engineering his own father's commitment to a psychiatric facility using forged documents was a crime that stripped away every pretense of basic human decency. He stated that the legal system relies on the assumption of truth, and that corrupting it with fabricated medical records constitutes a direct assault on the court itself. The judge announced that he found them both guilty on all counts of conspiracy wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. The sentencing came immediately and without mercy. The judge sentenced Nadine to 7 years in the state penitentiary. He then sentenced Derek to 12 years in state prison. He ordered them to pay full restitution for every dollar they had stolen, including the medical funds and the fraudulent credit lines. He mandated that their remaining liquidated assets be transferred directly to my corporate entity to satisfy the debts. The heavy wooden gavel struck the sounding block with a sharp, violent crack. That sound marked the absolute end of their privileged existence. The bailiffs moved forward and instructed Derek and Nadine to stand. Nadine began to weep silently as the steel cuffs were closed around her wrists. She was led away through the side door without a backward glance. Derek rose slowly. His face was entirely hollow. He looked at me one last time across that sterile room. There was no arrogance left in the way he held himself. There was no anger. There was only the vacant realization that he was about to spend the next decade of his life locked inside a concrete cell. He was escorted out, and the heavy door clicked shut behind him. Beckett latched his legal briefcase and gave me a single nod. The operation was finished. The disease components had been fully removed from the structural framework of my life. I stood and walked out of the courtroom. The thick limestone walls of that building felt entirely appropriate. Justice is simply correct engineering applied at the right moment. When you apply sufficient pressure to a corrupt element, it eventually shatters and leaves the sound material standing. I moved down the wide concrete steps and out into the bright winter afternoon. The gray clouds had broken completely, leaving a clean blue sky stretched wide over the city skyline. The cold air felt sharp and honest in my lungs. I walked toward my aging work van parked along the curb. I carried no residual sorrow. What I felt was the quiet, deep satisfaction of a man who has successfully restored the natural order. I climbed in and turned the engine over. The road ahead was unobstructed and the foundation was finally secure. Winter eventually released its grip, giving way to the slow, deliberate thaw of early spring. I have always valued the turning of seasons because it mirrors the necessary phases of any construction project. Winter is when you pour the concrete, letting the cold cure the foundation into an unbreakable slab. Spring is when you begin erecting the steel frame. My life had just survived a brutal winter of demolition and excavation. The rotted structure of my family had been razed all the way down to bedrock. Now, it was time to build something entirely new on the cleared earth. The first required action was the complete liquidation of the suburban house. The bank had executed their foreclosure against Derek's fraudulent debts, but my corporate entity held the master deed. Beckett and his team of attorneys worked with methodical precision to disentangle the property from the federal criminal investigation. The process demanded weeks of filing dense legal paperwork and negotiating with aggressive bank executives who were desperate to recoup their losses. Beckett applied exactly the pressure the situation required, using the federal indictments against my son as leverage to accelerate the clearance. Once the federal prosecutors formally released the physical asset, I directed Beckett to list the house on the open market without delay. I had no interest in retaining ownership of a structure that had sheltered so much deceit. A building absorbs the character of its occupants, and that house was saturated with vanity and entitlement. I drove out to the property one final time before the real estate brokers arrived. The neighborhood was quiet, and the manicured lawns were beginning to turn a deep green in the morning sun. I parked the aging work van in the empty circular driveway and unlocked the heavy oak front door. The interior was completely bare. The federal authorities and the bank liquidators had stripped out every piece of expensive furniture, every imported rug, and every crystal fixture that Nadine had purchased with my stolen money. My footsteps echoed through the grand foyer. The house had been reduced to its absolute fundamental geometry: wood drywall, glass, and steel. I moved through the empty rooms, inspecting the load-bearing walls and structural supports. Stripped of its superficial layers of luxury, the house was simply a functional arrangement of angles and corridors. I stood in the center of the vast living room, where Nadine had once screamed at me, and Derek had once threatened to have me locked away in a psychiatric ward. There were no ghosts in the corners. There was only vacant space and the smell of fresh paint left by the bank contractors. I felt a deep and complete sense of closure. The physical space had been cleansed of their contamination. I locked the front door for the last time and handed the keys to the broker waiting on the sidewalk. The house sold within 14 days. The real estate market in that exclusive gated community was fiercely competitive, and the property was acquired by a young physician and his wife. They paid in cash. Beckett finalized the transaction and wired the full proceeds directly into my primary offshore accounts. I sat at the small wooden table in my apartment and watched the digital numbers climb on my screen. The transaction was mathematically clean. The final thread connecting me to my past life had been severed and monetized. I felt no surge of greed when the funds landed. I am not a man who gauges his worth by the balance on a ledger. To me, money is a structural material. It is the steel rebar that reinforces the concrete of personal autonomy. For decades, I had allowed my son to draw that material off, steadily undermining my own foundation to prop up his towering delusions. I had compromised my own security to construct a life for a boy who ultimately saw me as nothing more than a disposable resource. That financial vulnerability had now been permanently erased. The substantial influx of capital from the sale of the house ensured I would never again be placed in a position of dependence. I held total absolute control over my medical care, my living arrangements, and my daily existence. There would be no more anxious calculations about covering basic necessities while my son rode around in leased black luxury sedans. There would be no more quiet sacrifices made in the shadow of his arrogance. The money sat inside a heavily encrypted digital vault, forming an impenetrable wall between me and the rest of the world. It generated a steady passive income that covered my modest needs with complete certainty. I chose to remain in my small apartment above the dry cleaner. Beckett had suggested I purchase a comfortable condominium in a secure luxury building, but I declined. I have never needed a great deal of space to feel at ease. A master architect understands that efficiency is always superior to excess. My apartment was compact and strictly functional. The floorboards were old, and the windows shuddered when the wind pushed through the downtown streets, but the place was entirely mine. Nobody ever showed up at my door demanding money. Nobody ever walked into my kitchen to pass judgment on my worn corduroy shirts or complain about the smell of my coffee. My daily routine became a masterpiece of unbroken silence. I was up at 5:00 in the morning, brewing a single cup of dark coffee. I sat beside the window and watched the city gradually come alive as the sun crested the industrial district. I spent my mornings drawing new architectural blueprints purely for the intellectual exercise. I worked out complex suspension bridges and intricate high-rise support structures at my drafting table, letting the clean logic of mathematics fill my mind. There were no emotional variables to account for. There were no unpredictable human elements to corrupt the equations. I found immense beauty in the rigid laws of physics. In the afternoons, I walked to the local public library or settled into a quiet corner of a neighborhood diner. I watched the people around me with a detached, peaceful curiosity. I saw families bickering over trivial matters and parents worn down by the demands of ungrateful children. I watched them labor under the heavy, invisible chains of biological obligation. I had worn those precise same chains for 45 years. I knew how the metal bit into the skin and how the cumulative weight slowly deformed the spine. Watching them now, I felt an overwhelming sense of lightness. The chains had been broken and I was entirely free. Society places a heavy, irrational emphasis on bloodline. People are conditioned from birth to believe that shared genetic material automatically ensures loyalty, respect, and unconditional love. It is a deeply flawed premise. Biology is merely a starting point. It is the raw, unrefined ore. Character is forged through actions, choices, and sustained integrity. Derek carried my genetic material, but he carried none of my character. He was a defective product of his own vanity and his own unchecked greed. I no longer thought of him as my son. I thought of him as a failed experiment. The 12-year sentence he was serving in the state penitentiary was not a tragedy to be mourned. It was the correct mathematical output produced by the variables he had fed into the equation. He had attempted to bypass the required labor of life by stealing the results. The universe corrects those errors in time. Nadine was serving her 7 years in a separate facility, stripped of her Cedar Brook Country Club status and her superficial pride. They were precisely where they belonged, fully contained by a system engineered to address extreme structural failure. I did not feel lonely in my isolation. Loneliness is the painful gap between the connection you expect and the connection you actually receive. I no longer expected any connection. I had accepted the absolute truth of my existence. I was a solitary structure standing on its own against the elements. I did not require external validation or familial warmth to hold my integrity intact. I found deep comfort in the predictability of my days and the complete silence of my evenings. Every choice I made was governed solely by my own preferences. The natural order of my universe was fully restored. For years, the equilibrium had been violently skewed by the parasitic demands of my ungrateful bloodline. The scale had finally been leveled. I had used the cold, unyielding machinery of the law to crush a rebellion built entirely on arrogance. I had not resorted to raised voices or physical force. I had simply stepped clear and allowed the full weight of their own actions to come down on them completely. I walked to the sink and washed my coffee cup, drying it with slow, deliberate care. The apartment was perfectly still. The security cameras I had installed months before were still running, but their blinking red lights no longer stood as a defensive perimeter against an approaching threat. They were simply quiet witnesses to my peaceful routine. The war was definitively over. The final blueprint had been drawn without a single error. I settled back at my wooden drafting table and lifted my pen. I was an old man living a quiet, invisible life, and I had never been stronger. That is where Clifford's story leaves us. Not with noise, not with shouting, but with a man standing quietly in the wreckage he designed, watching the last wall come down. What it cost him was decades. Decades of sacrifice, of silence, of watching a son treat generosity as weakness. I believe God has a way of balancing accounts that human courts sometimes cannot reach, but in this case, both caught up at once. The lesson Clifford carried out of that courtroom was not about money. It was about how long a man will ignore what is right in front of him when love is doing the blinding. If you have followed these father stories from the beginning, you already know the most dangerous thing a parent can do is confuse loyalty with enabling. Clifford's path, quiet, methodical, patient, is what Dad's revenge actually looks like when it is built on truth instead of rage. Here is what I take from it. First document, everything always. A paper trail is the only weapon that holds up when memory is called a lie. Second, the deed to your own life is something no one can sign away without your hand protected. Third, if someone insists you are too old or too weak to understand what is happening, they are usually the ones counting on you not to look closer. Fourth, patience is not passivity. Sometimes the most powerful move is simply outlasting the person who thought they had already won. If any part of this story moved, you leave a comment and tell me what hit hardest. And if you know someone carrying a weight like Clifford's, share this with them. They may need to hear it more than you know. Subscribe to His Hidden Revenge so you never miss what comes next. Thank you for spending this time with me. Take care of yourself out there, and I will see you in the next one.